In the summer of 1497, 4 small ships slipped out of Lisbon harbor on a Sunday morning tide, pointed their bows south into the Atlantic, and set course for a destination so distant and so lucrative that it had consumed 60 years of Portuguese ambition, bankrupted royal treasuries, and swallowed the lives of hundreds of sailors who never came home. A place called Calicut on the Spice Coast of India at the far end of the world. What followed was the most consequential sea voyage in history. Chapter 1. The Prize That Toppled Empires. The Spice Trade World of 1497. In the markets of 15th century Europe, the most expensive substances sold by weight were not gold or silver. They were pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. Tiny seeds, bark shavings, and dried flower buds carried from the farthest reaches of southern Asia across half the width of the known world, passing through the hands of Arab dhow captains, Persian caravan masters, Egyptian toll collectors, Levantine middlemen, and Venetian galley merchants before they reached the spice stalls of Lisbon, Antwerp, or London. By the time a sack of black pepper arrived on a northern European table, it had traveled perhaps 15,000 kilometers and changed hands 20 times, and at each exchange its price had risen. The markup between the pepper gardens of the Malabar Coast and the shops of a European city was roughly 60 to 1. A single ship that could sail directly from Lisbon to Calicut, load pepper at its source price, and return to Lisbon without touching a single intermediary port would earn a profit that dwarfed the combined annual revenues of most European principalities. This was not mere commerce, it was the most lucrative trade route in the known world, and every Christian kingdom on the Atlantic seaboard burned with the desire to break into it directly. For Portugal, the smallest and westernmost of those kingdoms, the desire had hardened over 6 decades of systematic maritime effort into something approaching national obsession. The sea route to Asia was the prize that justified every cost, every lost ship, every drowned sailor, every royal treasury emptied into the hulls of exploration vessels that sailed south and never returned. And in July 1497, after 60 years of preparation and failure and partial success, Portugal was finally ready to claim it. To understand why spices commanded such extraordinary prices, it helps to imagine the world before refrigeration. A world in which the preservation of food through the winter months was not a matter of convenience, but of survival, and in which the difference between palatable and inedible could be a matter of life and death. Salt was the primary preservative, but salt alone could not mask the taste of meat that had been curing for 6 months in a damp cellar, or make tolerable the monotony of a diet reduced to dried legumes and salted fish. Pepper, cinnamon, ginger, and cloves did more than flavor food. They disguised decay, stimulated appetite in the chronically hungry, and, in the case of cloves and cinnamon, possessed genuine antimicrobial properties that helped slow the processes of putrefaction in ways that no one yet understood scientifically, but that every cook and householder had learned empirically over generations. Beyond the kitchen, spices were the backbone of medieval pharmacology. The apothecary's shop was essentially a spice merchant's shop, and the remedies prescribed by physicians for every ailment from fever to melancholy to plague relied on the same pepper, ginger, cardamom, and nutmeg that flavored the food of the wealthy. Cinnamon compounded into medicines was believed to strengthen the heart. Cloves pressed into oil were applied to aching teeth.
Nutmeg, carried in a small bag against the chest, was thought to ward off disease. Spices scented the incense burned in churches, perfumed the bodies of the noble dead, flavored the wines drunk at royal banquets, and filled the chests of the bride's dowry as a declaration of family wealth. They were, in the most literal and comprehensive sense, inseparable from the material, medical, and spiritual life of European civilization. And every one of them came from a corner of the world that Europe could not reach without paying tribute to a chain of Muslim middlemen who had no reason whatsoever to make the journey cheaper.
The ancient spice route had functioned in one form or another for more than 1,000 years before Vasco da Gama was born, and its basic geography had changed remarkably little over those centuries. It wound from the pepper gardens and cinnamon groves of the Malabar coast and from the nutmeg and clove islands of the Moluccas westward across the Indian Ocean, funneling through the bottleneck of the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf, crossing the Arabian Peninsula by caravan through cities that had grown rich precisely because they sat at the intersections of sea and land trade, and terminating at the great emporiums of the eastern Mediterranean, Alexandria in Egypt, Beirut on the Levantine coast, and Constantinople, the great city on the Bosphorus where the trade routes of 3 continents converged. There, Venetian and Genoese merchants picked up the goods in bulk and distributed them north and west across Europe through a commercial network so deeply entrenched, so enormously profitable, and so jealously guarded by its participants that it amounted to one of the most powerful economic monopolies in world history. The Venetians, above all others, had built their entire civilization on this trade. Their magnificent palaces lining the Grand Canal were constructed from spice profits. Their naval power rested on the same foundation, and their diplomatic relationships with the sultans and emirs of the eastern Mediterranean had been maintained with extraordinary sophistication for centuries, precisely to protect their privileged access to the overland route. To disturb that arrangement was to threaten not just a commercial interest, but the economic basis of one of Europe's most formidable states. And the Venetians, above all others, had been fully capable of using diplomacy, bribery, and force to prevent any new player from cutting them out of the trade they regarded as their birthright. Portugal's attempt to find a sea route around Africa was, among other things, a direct challenge to Venetian commercial supremacy, and the Venetians knew it and feared it long before da Gama's ships rounded the Cape of Good Hope.
The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 sent a shock wave through the commercial world of the Mediterranean that reverberated for decades. The Ottomans were not interested in destroying the overland spice trade. It was too valuable, and they were perfectly happy to tax it. But they were under no obligation to give Christian merchants favorable terms of transit through their territory, and they didn't. Duties on goods passing through Ottoman-controlled ports and caravanserais rose. Those costs were passed along the chain to European buyers, and the price of pepper and cinnamon in Lisbon and Paris climbed accordingly. More fundamentally, the fall of Constantinople was a psychological event of enormous power. It demonstrated with terrible clarity that Muslim power now stood astride every land route between Western Europe and the productive heartlands of Asia. That Christian access to the spice trade depended entirely on the goodwill or the greed of rulers who were not Christian and who had every reason to extract maximum value from their position as gatekeepers. For a kingdom like Portugal, sitting at the far western edge of the continent, with an Atlantic coastline and a growing tradition of ocean-going seamanship, the logic of the situation was becoming increasingly clear.
If the overland route was controlled by rivals, the answer was to find a sea route that bypassed it entirely. This was not an original insight. The idea of sailing around Africa to reach India had been entertained by geographers and visionaries for decades before 1453. But the fall of Constantinople gave it a new urgency, a new political justification, and a new sense of competitive pressure that transformed what had been a geographical curiosity into a strategic imperative. The Portuguese had already been pushing south along the African coast for 30 years when Constantinople fell. They accelerated their efforts after it, and the Cape of Good Hope was the direct result of that acceleration.
Portugal's exploration program along the African coast had been underway since the 1420s, when Prince Henry, known to posterity as Henry the Navigator, though he never navigated anything himself, established his household at Sagres on the windswept southwestern tip of Portugal and began the systematic business of funding southward voyages. Henry's motivations were a characteristically medieval mixture: the commercial desire for access to the gold trade of sub-Saharan Africa, whose caravans crossed the Sahara to reach North African ports, the religious desire to find Christian allies, the legendary Prester John, a Christian king believed to rule somewhere in Africa or Asia, whose armies might outflank the Muslim powers that hemmed Christianity in from the south and east, and a genuine intellectual curiosity about the shape of the world that extended beyond the edges of the maps his geographers could draw. His captains pushed south year by year, using the small, nimble caravels that the Portuguese had developed specifically for coastal exploration in variable winds, past the Canary Islands, past Cape Bojador, which had been the effective southern limit of European navigation for decades because of its reputation for dangerous winds and currents and its position in the doldrums where the trade winds failed, past the bulge of West Africa into the tropics, and ever further south, into waters where the familiar northern stars were sinking toward the horizon and new southern constellations were rising to take their place. Henry died in 1460 without having achieved his most ambitious goal, direct contact with the gold of Guinea, but having launched a process of maritime exploration that had its own momentum and its own institutional base in the royal court. After his death, the Portuguese crown continued the work with undiminished energy and increasing sophistication, sending larger fleets with better equipment and more carefully selected commanders, measuring and recording the geometry of the southern sky, building the body of practical navigational knowledge that would eventually make the India voyage possible.
The reign of João II, the king known as the Perfect Prince, who ruled Portugal from 1481 to 1495, was the period of maximum achievement in the African exploration program, and it was João's preparations that made da Gama's voyage possible. João was one of the most formidably intelligent kings Portugal ever produced, a man who understood strategy, commerce, and geography with unusual clarity, who was willing to invest enormous resources in long-term projects whose payoffs were uncertain and distant, and who had the political will to suppress the opposition of the Portuguese nobility long enough to build the centralized royal authority that the exploration program required. Under his patronage, Diogo Cao reached the mouth of the Congo River in 1482 and planted the first of the stone pillars, padrões, each inscribed with the Portuguese royal arms, that would mark the progress of successive voyages down the African coast, like pins moving toward a destination everyone could see on the map, but no one had yet reached. Cao sailed again in 1485,
reaching the Cape Cross region of present-day Namibia, still far short of the southern tip of Africa, but further than any European had gone before. And then, in August 1487, João sent Bartolomeu Dias south with 3 vessels and the specific instruction to find the southern end of Africa, to round it if possible, and to determine whether the Indian Ocean was accessible by sea from the Atlantic. Dias returned in December 1488, having accomplished all 3 objectives. He had rounded the Cape, which his terrified crew had named the Cape of Storms, in a huge storm that had swept the fleet far to the south before it could regain the coast, and he had sailed northeast along the Indian Ocean coast of Africa as far as the Great Fish River before his crew, at the absolute limit of their endurance, refused to go further. He brought back a chart of the Cape's position and the first reliable evidence that Africa had a southern end and that the Indian Ocean beyond it was an open sea. What remained to be done was to actually sail across that sea to India, and that task fell to Vasco da Gama. 9 years separated Bartolomeu Dias's rounding of the Cape from Vasco da Gama's departure, and those years were not wasted. João II's final years were consumed by the political and diplomatic fallout from Columbus's 1492 voyage, which had introduced an unexpected rival into the race for Asian trade, Spain, whose claim to the western route to Asia threatened to complicate Portugal's carefully constructed southern strategy. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 drew a line through the Atlantic and assigned everything to the west of it to Spain, everything to the east to Portugal, a diplomatic resolution that confirmed Portugal's exclusive claim to the African route to India, and gave Manuel I, when he succeeded João in 1495, a clean legal foundation on which to build the India enterprise. Manuel moved quickly. He immediately authorized the construction of the 2 new carracks, São Gabriel and São Rafael, that would be the backbone of the fleet, incorporating everything Portuguese shipwrights had learned from 60 years of ocean sailing into vessels specifically designed for the conditions of the South Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. He summoned the best pilots in Portugal, commissioned the astronomical tables from Abraham Zacuto, stockpiled provisions for 3 years, and assembled the trade goods and diplomatic letters that da Gama would carry to the rulers of India. The preparation was as thorough as human knowledge and royal resources could make it, and yet, as every sailor on the fleet must have understood, no preparation could fully account for what lay beyond the Cape, because no European had ever been beyond the Cape. The Indian Ocean was a blank on every Portuguese chart, its winds and currents known only by inference from the accounts of Arab pilots and the fragments of classical geography that had survived the Middle Ages. They were sailing in the most literal sense into the unknown, guided by the best knowledge of their age toward a destination that their age had never reached. The commercial stakes of the venture were staggering, and everyone in Lisbon who had any connection to the Mediterranean trade understood precisely how staggering they were. Portuguese merchants with knowledge of the Venetian spice business knew the profit margins that existed between the production cost of pepper in Calicut and its selling price in a European market, and they understood that a ship that could eliminate the Arab, Persian, and Italian intermediaries from that chain would generate returns of a scale that no other form of commerce available to European merchants could approach. A single well-loaded ship that returned from Calicut to Lisbon with its holds full of pepper and cinnamon could pay for the entire cost of fitting out the expedition and still return several times that sum in profit. Multiply that by an annual fleet of 6 or 8 ships, and Portugal, a kingdom of perhaps 1.5 million people tucked into the southwestern corner of Europe, without the agricultural wealth of France or the commercial sophistication of Venice, could become the commercial center of the known world, the entrepot through which all Asian goods reached European markets, the issuer of the permits and levies that every merchant who wanted access to Indian spices would have to pay. The transformation this would work on Portuguese society was visible even before da Gama's ships returned. King Manuel was already styling himself Lord of the conquest, navigation, and commerce of Ethiopia, Arabia, Persia, and India, commissioning the building of the Jeronimos monastery from revenues he had not yet collected, and acting with the confidence of a man who already knew how the story ended. He was right. But the story's ending would cost something that no one in Lisbon, watching the 4 small ships disappear down the Tagus on that Sunday morning in July 1497, could yet fully calculate. 2/3 of the men who sailed with the fleet, and the first chapter of the most violent commercial empire the Indian Ocean had ever seen.
Portugal possessed, in 1497, something that no other European kingdom had accumulated to anything like the same degree: 60 years of practical knowledge about the wind and current systems of the South Atlantic and the approach to the Cape of Good Hope. While Spanish exploration had been focused entirely on the western Atlantic since Columbus's 1492 voyage, and while the maritime powers of northern Europe, England, France, the Netherlands, were still primarily concerned with North Atlantic fisheries and coastal trade, Portuguese navigators had been building a body of empirical knowledge about the southern oceans that was comprehensive, carefully recorded, and jealously guarded as a state secret. The great southwest trades of the South Atlantic, the behavior of the Benguela current along the African coast, the position and character of the South Atlantic high-pressure system, the seasonal changes in the wind patterns around the Cape, the approximate latitude at which westerly winds could be found in the deep Southern Ocean, all of this existed in Portuguese charts, pilot books, and, most importantly, in the memories of the small number of pilots who had sailed far enough south to experience it firsthand. Chief among those pilots was Pero de Alenquer, who had served as chief pilot to Bartolomeu Dias on the 1488 voyage, and who now held in his accumulated experience the most complete practical knowledge of the South Atlantic route to the Cape available to anyone on Earth. Alenquer's appointment as chief pilot of the São Gabriel was, in navigational terms, the single most important decision in the preparation of the expedition. Everything else, the new ships, the astronomical tables, the diplomatic letters, depended, in the final analysis, on a pilot who knew where the winds were and how to use them. Alenquer knew. And the route he and da Gama would choose, the great clockwise arc across the open South Atlantic that became known as the Volta do Mar on a continental scale, would prove, in retrospect, to be one of the most brilliant navigational decisions in the history of the sea.
The man chosen to command this most consequential of all Portuguese expeditions was not the most famous navigator in Portugal, not the veteran of the furthest previous voyage, not the man who had personally rounded the Cape and glimpsed the Indian Ocean and turned back short of the prize. That man was Bartolomeu Dias, who had every experiential claim to lead the follow-up voyage his own reconnaissance had made possible, and who would in fact serve as the expedition's guide as far as the Cape Verde Islands before departing to take up his posting as captain of the Gold Coast Fort. The India command went instead to Vasco da Gama, a minor nobleman from the Atlantic port of Sines, born around 1460,
with military experience in land campaigns against Castile and some familiarity with maritime affairs through his family connections and his service in royal coastal operations. He was not a great navigator in the technical sense. He had not, as far as the record shows, ever commanded a deep-sea voyage. What he possessed was something harder to specify, but more important for this particular mission: a force of personal authority so commanding that it kept fractious crews disciplined across 2 years at sea, a coldness in the face of danger and difficulty that never wavered, even when the deaths around him were mounting, and a diplomatic toughness, the capacity to negotiate without conceding, to threaten without being called on the threat, and to impose Portuguese terms on reluctant interlocutors through sheer projection of will and firepower that the voyage ahead would require at every difficult encounter. João II had identified da Gama for the command before his death, apparently seeing in him precisely the combination of social authority, military temperament, and iron determination that the India mission demanded. Manuel confirmed the appointment and gave da Gama everything the fleet needed. The choice proved entirely correct, not because da Gama was a gentle or admirable man, but because the India voyage was not, in the end, a gentle or admirable enterprise, and it needed the man he was.
Następnie król zbliżył się do da Gamy, tak blisko, że żeglarz mógł poczuć zapach drogiego wina i strachu bijący z oddechu monarchy. To był ten moment, w którym padł prawdziwy, niewypowiedziany w żadnych oficjalnych dokumentach rozkaz. Manuel mówił tonem fanatyka, przekazując swojemu kapitanowi świętą i przerażającą misję. Będziesz naszym ambasadorem. Jeśli to możliwe, szeptał władca, zaciskając dłoń na krawędzi stołu, aż pobielały mu knykcie. Będziesz niósł listy z propozycją handlu i pokoju. Ale posłuchaj mnie uważnie, da Gama. Jeśli tamtejsi władcy odmówią współpracy, jeśli kupcy arabscy spróbują zablokować wam dostęp do portów, jeśli napotkasz jakikolwiek opór, którego nie da się przełamać uśmiechem i złotem, masz moje pełne królewskie pełnomocnictwo, by spuścić z łańcucha piekło. Rozkazuję ci użyć artylerii bez zawahania. Masz prawo bombardować ich bezcenne, starożytne miasta, palić wrogie statki handlowe, brać na zakładników kobiety i dzieci, torturować ich dowódców i topić całe załogi we krwi, bylebyś osiągnął cel. Okrucieństwo nie jest w tej misji opcją ani wypadkiem przy pracy, jeśli zajdzie taka potrzeba, jest absolutnym wymogiem. Nie wolno ci wrócić z pustymi ładowniami. Jeśli musisz stać się potworem, by uratować Portugalię, to nim zostaniesz. W imię Boga i mojej korony.
Słowa te zawisły w gęstym powietrzu komnaty jak wyrok śmierci, a ciężar przeznaczenia opadł na ramiona Vasco da Gamy z fizyczną niemal siłą. Król zasadniczo żądał od niego, by poświęcił nie tylko swoje życie, z czym weteran pogodził się już dawno, ale by zaryzykował wieczne potępienie własnej duszy, biorąc na siebie grzechy zniszczenia, morderstwa i bezlitosnej tyranii na krańcach świata, gdzie nie sięgało ani prawe oko sprawiedliwości, ani litość Kościoła. Atmosfera w gabinecie stała się nieznośnie duszna. Zapach stopionego wosku zmieszał się z metalicznym, ostrym aromatem naoliwionej zbroi i starego potu, który przesączał się przez skórzany dublet żołnierza. Cienie rzucane przez płomienie świec na kamienne ściany zdawały się ożywać, wydłużając się w upiorne kształty demonów wojennych i aniołów śmierci, tańczących wokół dwóch mężczyzn, knujących zagładę połowy świata. Da Gama miał świadomość, że jeśli zawiedzie, pochłonie go czarna woda lub zginie z rąk tubylców, a jego imię przepadnie w mrokach historii jako przypis do kolejnej porażki. Jednak jeśli zwycięży, stosując narzucone mu bestialskie metody, stanie się uosobieniem terroru, drapieżnikiem, którego podręczniki nazwą bohaterem, podczas gdy w rzeczywistości będzie katem.
Przez ułamek sekundy panowała grobowa cisza, podczas której da Gama przetwarzał te mroczne dyspozycje. Nie było w nim oburzenia, nie było moralnego rozdarcia ani strachu przed brzemieniem, któremu właśnie narzucono. Wręcz przeciwnie, w mrocznych zakamarkach jego umysłu ta brutalna wizja misji idealnie rezonowała z jego naturą. Bezwzględność była językiem, który rozumiał najlepiej, a siła stanowiła jedyną uniwersalną walutę w świecie pełnym drapieżników. Z powolnym, celowym ruchem, z którego emanowała groźna, żelazna gracja, Vasco da Gama uklęknął na jedno kolano przed biurkiem władczy. Migotliwe światło kandelabru oświetliło ostro zarysowane kości policzkowe, głęboką bliznę przecinającą brew i twarde jak obsydian oczy, w których nie było ani cienia litości. Przyjmuję to brzemię, wasza królewska mość, powiedział głosem cichym, ale nasyconym absolutną, drapieżną pewnością siebie, która sprawiła, że nawet król poczuł chłód na karku. Zdobędę dla Portugalii klucze do Indii i przyniosę wam przyprawy, o które prosicie. A jeśli ocean lub pogańscy królowie staną mi na drodze, przysięgam na ten krzyż, że przepłynę do celu przez morze ich krwi, a miasta, które nam się przeciwstawią, obrócę w popiół, który zmyje dopiero następny monsun.
Napięcie w pomieszczeniu opadło, zastąpione przez ponurą ostateczność przypieczętowanego paktu. Gdy audiencja dobiegła końca, Vasco da Gama powoli podniósł się z kolan, skłonił lekko głowę w chłodnym żołnierskim salucie i bez pośpiechu odwrócił się na pięcie, opuszczając klaustrofobiczny gabinet. Jego kroki dudniły w długich, pustych korytarzach pałacu Ribiera, gdy zostawiał za sobą intrygi, jedwabie i perfumowane obawy dworu. Wyszedł w chłodną, gęstą mgłę spowijającą strome kamienne schody prowadzące prosto w dół, ku rzece Tag i dzielnicy portowej Restela. W mrocznej zawiesinie poranka majaczyły przed nim potężne drewniane szkielety 4 statków: São Gabriel, São Rafael, Berrio i potężnego statku zaopatrzeniowego. Ich żebra wznosiły się ku szaremu niebu niczym klatki piersiowe uśpionych lewiatanów czekających na ożywienie. Zimny, przeszywający wiatr z nad oceanu uderzył go w twarz, niosąc ze sobą zapach soli, gnijącego drewna, smoły i bezgranicznej, przerażającej otchłani nieznanego świata. Klamka zapadła. Bezwzględna maszyna historii właśnie została wprawiona w ruch. Stary, duszny świat średniowiecznej Europy chylił się ku nieuchronnemu upadkowi, a na horyzoncie, spowita dymem z działu i krwią, wschodziła nowa, brutalna era globalnych imperiów. Vasco da Gama poprawił ciężki płaszcz na ramionach i z zaciśniętymi szczękami ruszył prosto w objęcia sztormu, gotów rzucić wyzwanie samemu przeznaczeniu.
Chapter 2. Da Gama's Commission. The man King Manuel chose.
Vasco da Gama was born in Sines, a modest fishing port on the Portuguese Atlantic coast, sometime around 1460. The exact date is unrecorded, as befits a man whose later fame was entirely unanticipated at his birth. Sines was not an insignificant place. It was a royal town with a small harbor used by the fishing boats that worked the Atlantic waters of the Alentejo coast, and it had a functioning castle and a resident noble class connected by appointment and family to the court at Lisbon. But it was not Lisbon, and the da Gama family, for all their minor noble status, were not great figures in Portuguese public life. Vasco's father, Estevão da Gama, served as alcaide-mor of Sines, a royal administrative appointment roughly equivalent to a local military governor, and had reportedly been designated by King João II to lead the India voyage that the crown had been planning since the late 1480s. Whether this story is accurate or represents a later embellishment designed to give the da Gama family's involvement in the India enterprise a neater dynastic logic, the practical result was the same. When the commission was finally confirmed by King Manuel I in 1496, it went to Vasco da Gama, and it arrived carrying not just the weight of royal authority, but a strong sense of inherited obligation, of a mission that was, in some sense, already written into the family name.
Vasco had served in military campaigns against Castile and in royal coastal operations, acquiring a practical soldier's and sailor's education without the theoretical navigation training of the pilots who would actually plot the fleet's course. He was educated enough to manage diplomacy and write reports. He was physically brave and militarily decisive. And he had, by every account, the kind of personal authority that makes other men follow without being told twice. He was approximately 36 or 37 years old when the fleet departed Lisbon in July 1497, in the prime of a life that had been preparing for something important without yet knowing exactly what it was, and he stepped into the command with the certainty of a man who has been waiting for precisely this moment.
Contemporary accounts of da Gama's character are consistent enough across multiple independent sources to constitute a reliable portrait, and that portrait is not a comfortable one. He was a man of formidable personal authority, of the kind that intimidates rather than inspires, that commands through the threat of consequence rather than the warmth of fellowship. He was decisive to the point of ruthlessness. When he judged that violence was necessary, he applied it quickly and without apparent moral hesitation, whether against San hunter-gatherers on the South African coast, Arab merchants on the Swahili coast, or Muslim pilgrims on subsequent voyages. He was suspicious and calculating in negotiations, always assuming that apparent goodwill concealed a trap, always looking for the leverage that would allow him to extract terms he could not have achieved through persuasion alone. He was capable of a ferocity that his contemporaries found impressive rather than disturbing. This was, after all, a century in which the violence of commerce and conquest was generally regarded as normal, but that subsequent generations have recognized as something that shades into atrocity. On his second India voyage in 1502, he would burn a ship carrying hundreds of Muslim pilgrims, locking the hatches from outside so that no one could escape, as a demonstration of Portuguese power and a message to the rulers of the Malabar coast. These qualities were not incidental to his success, they were central to it. The India voyage required not just a navigator who could find the route, but a commander who could hold a fleet together through 2 years of extreme hardship, who could negotiate effectively with rulers who had every reason to be hostile, and who could enforce Portuguese commercial interests by threat and violence when diplomacy failed. Da Gama was all of these things, and the voyage could not have been completed by a gentler man. His older brother, Paulo, who commanded the São Rafael, was everything Vasco was not: warm, beloved, steady, the kind of natural leader who earns loyalty rather than demanding it. Their relationship, the cold, implacable younger brother and the gentle, generous older one, was one of the more human threads running through an enterprise that was, in most of its official dimensions, almost entirely impersonal.
King Manuel I came to the Portuguese throne in October 1495, when his cousin João II died without a legitimate heir, at the age of 40, in the prime of his reign. Manuel was 26 years old at his accession, inexperienced in government, but possessed of enormous inherited wealth, a deep personal piety, and an ambition to make his reign the moment at which Portugal fulfilled what he genuinely believed was its divine destiny. He called himself, in anticipation of achievements he had not yet accomplished, Lord of the conquest, navigation, and commerce of Ethiopia, Arabia, Persia, and India. A title of almost comical ambition from a king whose kingdom had never traded directly with any of those places, but he meant it with complete sincerity. Manuel was not primarily a strategic thinker in the way that João II had been. He was more comfortable with the ceremonial and religious dimensions of kingship than with the cold calculations of diplomacy and commerce. But he understood with perfect clarity that the India voyage was the defining project of his reign, and perhaps of his dynasty, and he committed his personal prestige and his royal treasury to it without reservation. The Geronimos monastery that he began constructing near the chapel at Belém, the waterside chapel where da Gama's crew had kept their vigil the night before departure, was a physical expression of Manuel's sense of the religious significance of the enterprise, a monument to Portugal's achievement and a thank offering to God, financed directly from the spice trade revenues that he was already counting in his imagination. His vision for what the India trade could become was explicitly imperial. He did not envision a commercial partnership with the rulers of the Malabar coast, but a Portuguese monopoly enforced by naval power that would redirect the entire flow of Asian spices from the Mediterranean route through Lisbon. The gap between that vision and the reality that da Gama found at Calicut, a sophisticated commercial world with its own established hierarchies and power structures, deeply resistant to Portuguese commercial demands, would generate a century of violent conflict in the Indian Ocean. But in the summer of 1497, as he waited in Lisbon for the fleet's return, Manuel saw only the vision, not the resistance, and his confidence was absolute.
The preparation of the fleet extended far beyond the building of ships and the selection of commanders. The navigational infrastructure of the voyage was as carefully assembled as the hardware. Pedro de Alenquer, appointed chief pilot of the São Gabriel, brought with him the only direct experience of the Cape of Good Hope in the fleet. He had rounded it with Bartolomeu Dias in 1488 and knew its character, its storms, and the behavior of the South Atlantic currents in its vicinity better than any other pilot alive. The mathematician and astronomer Abraham Zacuto, a Jewish scholar who had taken refuge in Portugal after the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492, provided the expedition with newly compiled astronomical tables, the Almanac Perpetuum, that gave da Gama's pilots the ability to determine their latitude with precision using a simplified astrolabe at any point in the southern hemisphere, even in waters where no European star chart had ever been drawn. This was not a trivial advantage. Precise latitude measurement was the foundation of the dead reckoning navigation that would guide the fleet across the open South Atlantic, and without Zacuto's tables, the confidence required to attempt the 93-day open ocean passage of the South Atlantic would have been very much harder to sustain. The fleet also carried a graduated cross-staff and quadrant for solar observations, and Pedro de Alenquer's personal knowledge of the sun's declination tables in the southern hemisphere accumulated over his 1488 voyage. Together, these instruments and this knowledge gave the fleet's navigators tools that were unmatched in any other European maritime tradition of the time. The Spanish had good navigators after Columbus, but they were navigating in the North Atlantic and the Caribbean, familiar latitudes with known star positions. Da Gama's pilots were working in the deep Southern Ocean under unfamiliar stars, with instruments that had to be used differently from their Northern Hemisphere configurations, relying on calculations that had been derived from only one previous passage and that were being extended beyond any previously tested limit. That they succeeded so completely is a measure both of the quality of the tools they had been given and of the exceptional skill of the men who used them.
The diplomatic preparation for the voyage was as extensive as the navigational preparation, and in some ways more revealing of the assumptions and the misunderstandings that the Portuguese carried with them toward India. King Manuel's letters to the rulers of India were written with genuine diplomatic care. They were translated into Arabic and presented on parchment with the royal seal, addressing the Zamorin of Calicut and other rulers as fellow monarchs and proposing a relationship of commercial partnership between Christian kingdoms. They carried gifts, cloth, tin objects, coral, oil, honey, sugar that had been deemed appropriate by officials who had no direct knowledge of Indian court culture and who appear to have assumed, on no particular evidence, that the standards of diplomatic exchange practiced in West African courts would transfer to the courts of sophisticated Hindu rulers who had been trading with the Arab world for a millennium. This assumption was catastrophically wrong, as da Gama would discover with maximum embarrassment in the Zamorin's audience hall, but it reflects the genuine limits of Portuguese knowledge of the Indian Ocean world in 1497. 60 years of African coastal exploration had given Portugal detailed knowledge of West and Southern African conditions, but almost nothing about India except what could be inferred from Arab geographical writings and the accounts of a few travelers whose accuracy was uncertain. The padrones, the stone pillars inscribed with the royal arms and the date of Portuguese arrival that da Gama carried to plant at significant points along the route were a statement about sovereignty that the peoples who would encounter them were not necessarily in a position to understand or to contest, but that would be legible to any subsequent European voyage as a Portuguese claim. The degradados, the condemned criminals whose sentences had been commuted in exchange for service on the expedition, represented a darker aspect of the diplomatic preparation. They were the sacrifice that the Crown was willing to make to gather intelligence at points too dangerous for regular sailors, men who could be put ashore in hostile ports and either would survive and return with information or would not, at a cost that the Crown had already decided it could bear. The entire apparatus of preparation, the ships, the pilots, the instruments, the letters, the gifts, the padrones, the degradados, expressed the full range of Portuguese intentions, not exploration in the innocent sense, but the establishment of commercial and military dominance over a sea route that Portugal intended to own.
The volatile, highly combustible mixture of seasoned, deeply superstitious mariners and desperate, violent convicts required an incredibly strong, perfectly balanced command structure to prevent immediate bloody mutiny before the fleet even managed to clear the mouth of the Tagus River. This delicate, critical, psychological balance was perfectly embodied in the stark, fascinating contrast between Vasco da Gama's cold, tyrannical, iron-fisted authority and the deeply comforting, immensely stabilizing presence of his older brother, Paulo da Gama, the newly appointed captain of the São Rafael. Paulo was everything Vasco was not. He possessed a gentle, profoundly empathetic soul, a man whose quiet, dignified voice and inherently kind demeanor commanded deep, unshakable respect and fierce personal loyalty from the rough, hardened sailors without ever needing to resort to the cruel, violent lash or the threat of the irons. Sitting together in the captain's quarters during the frantic final days of preparation, the warm, golden light of an oil lantern catching the deep, contrasting lines of their faces, the two brothers formed an absolutely impenetrable, symbiotic core of leadership, Vasco acting as the sharp, unyielding steel tip of the spear, and Paulo as the flexible, unbreakable wooden shaft that held the dangerous enterprise together. They were joined in this intimate, critical council by Pero de Alenquer, the chief pilot of the fleet and the single most experienced, highly revered mariner in all of Portugal, a grizzled, deeply weathered veteran who had miraculously survived the treacherous, nightmare-inducing southern journey with Bartolomeu Dias. Alenquer, whose calloused, leathery hands traced invisible, terrifying routes across the worn parchment maps, brought a necessary, deeply sobering grimness to the command staff, his tales of monstrous, towering, rogue waves and hidden, jagged reefs serving as a constant, morbid reminder that the ocean cared absolutely nothing for their ambitions, their courage, or their royal decrees. As the physical construction of the ships reached its glorious, chaotic conclusion, the overwhelming, deeply complex logistical nightmare of provisioning the fleet for a highly speculative, continuous 3-year journey began in earnest, transforming the docks into a groaning, creaking mountain of carefully calculated survival supplies.
The sheer staggering volume of basic sustenance required to keep 170 heavy working men alive across thousands of miles of completely uncharted hostile ocean was a mathematical obsession that consumed the fleet's purveyors, demanding absolute, unfailing precision. From sunrise to sunset, the heavy wooden cranes continuously winched massive iron-bound oak barrels into the dark, yawning holds of the vessels, filling the humid, enclosed spaces with the overwhelming, highly pungent aromas of sour wine, sharp vinegar, heavy olive oil, and the sharp, stinging scent of heavily salted meat. Thousands of pounds of deeply cured, rock-hard salted pork and beef, aggressively preserved in brine to desperately stave off the inevitable creeping rot of the tropics, were meticulously stacked alongside massive, sealed vats of fresh river water, which the sailors grimly knew would soon turn violently green, stagnant and foul-tasting under the blistering heat of the equatorial sun. Every single inch of available cargo space was utilized with absolute, ruthless efficiency, transforming the deep bellies of the São Gabriel, the São Rafael, and the Berrio into floating, heavily fortified granaries and butcheries, heavily laden floating fortresses completely isolated from any possibility of resupply, deeply burdened by the terrifying realization that if the calculations were even slightly wrong, the entire crew would slowly, agonizingly starve to death in the middle of a vast, empty blue desert.
Yet the absolute foundational cornerstone of their meager, highly depressing diet, the singular item that truly symbolized the grueling, deeply unpleasant reality of a 15th century mariner's life, was the massive, towering sacks of biscoito, the notoriously dense, rock-hard ship's biscuit. Baked entirely without moisture in massive, specialized royal ovens located near the shipyards, this incredibly coarse, completely unpalatable bread was baked over and over again until it achieved the terrifying consistency of actual stone, designed specifically to resist the aggressive, deeply pervasive mold and the ravenous, destructive weevils that infested every corner of the dark, damp ships. As the massive, dusty sacks of biscoito were roughly dragged across the gangways, leaving long, powdery white trails upon the dark, freshly tarred decking, seasoned sailors eyed the provisions with a deeply ingrained, highly justified sense of profound dread. They knew from bitter, painful experience that within a mere few months, these rock-hard biscuits would inevitably become thoroughly infested with fat, writhing maggots and deeply saturated with the foul, foul-smelling bilge water, forcing the desperate men to consume their rations in absolute pitch-black darkness so they would not have to visibly witness the horrific, crawling things they were ingesting to survive. This dry, completely vitamin-devoid sustenance was the grim, undeniable harbinger of the horrific, terrifying specter of scurvy, the silent, deeply agonizing killer that would eventually rot their gums, loosen their teeth, and slowly disintegrate their bodies from the inside out, a terrible, looming physical sacrifice demanded by the vast, unyielding ocean in exchange for the glorious prize of the Indies.
Amidst the vital, absolutely necessary provisions of survival, the deep holds of the ships were also slowly, methodically filled with the goods intended for highly lucrative diplomatic trade. A severely flawed, profoundly arrogant process that starkly revealed the deep, tragic ignorance of the Portuguese regarding the immense sophistication of the Eastern world. Working from vastly outdated, fundamentally inaccurate assumptions regarding the economic realities of the distant Indian Ocean, royal officials systematically loaded the newly built caravels with incredibly cheap, highly unimpressive items typically used for basic, rudimentary barter along the rural, less developed coasts of West Africa. Crates overflowing with coarse, rough-woven striped cotton cloth, heavy iron wash basins, cheap strands of brightly colored glass beads, and simple rudimentary tin bells were carefully stowed away, deeply guarded as if they were precious, highly sought-after treasures.
It was a massive, fatal miscalculation born of severe European hubris, a deeply flawed assumption that the immensely wealthy, highly advanced rulers of Calicut, who were accustomed to trading in mountains of fine silk, flawless rubies, and deeply aromatic spices, would somehow be deeply impressed by these pathetic, rudimentary trinkets. As Vasco da Gama watched the final crates of glass beads being lowered into the dark hold of his flagship, completely unaware of the intense, profound humiliation and the violent, highly dangerous diplomatic crises these pathetic goods would eventually cause him in the opulent courts of India, he believed he was fully, adequately prepared to aggressively negotiate with the greatest, wealthiest empires the world had ever known. Finally, the frenetic, chaotic, heavily sensory-overloaded noise of the shipyard slowly, agonizingly died away as the sun violently dipped below the horizon on the eve of their grand, terrifying departure, casting the dark, gently rolling waters of the Tagus River into a deep, impenetrable, and deeply symbolic blackness. The three ships, incredibly heavy in the water, their massive hulls sitting deep, pregnant with months of provisions, heavy stone pillars, bronze cannons, and the desperate, terrified hopes of 170 heavily conflicted souls, lay gently at anchor, their towering silhouettes looking like dark, jagged phantoms against the deep, star-studded indigo canvas of the night sky. The only visible light came from the warm, heavily flickering amber glow of the small oil lanterns hanging rigidly from the intricate rigging, their reflections dancing nervously, frantically upon the dark, moving surface of the cold river water. Vasco da Gama stood absolutely alone on the high, commanding aft deck of the São Gabriel, his heavy velvet cloak wrapped tightly against the biting, deeply chilling maritime breeze, the silence of the night pressing down upon him with the immense, absolutely crushing weight of his impending, terrifying destiny. The incredibly complex blueprint of his boundless, violent ambition had finally, irrevocably become a tangible, creaking, heavily armed reality of wood, iron, and canvas. There was no longer any room for theoretical cartography, no more time for shipyard adjustments, and absolutely no possibility of turning back, for tomorrow they would violently, aggressively cast off the thick hemp ropes that bound them to the known, safe world, and plunge headfirst into the dark, terrifying, deeply unforgiving abyss of history.
Chapter 3. The Fleet of 1497. São Gabriel, São Rafael, and the Berrio.
On the morning of July 8, 1497, a Sunday, as the anonymous author of the Roteiro took care to record, the fleet assembled at the mouth of the Tagus River at Belém, on the western outskirts of Lisbon, with a great estuary broadened into something approaching the sea. The sailors had spent the previous night in vigil prayer at the small whitewashed chapel of Santa Maria de Belém, keeping an all-night devotion of the kind that Portuguese mariners undertook before dangerous voyages, receiving absolution from the priests who would sail with them and from those who would stay behind and pray for their return. The Bishop of Lisbon had blessed the fleet in a public ceremony the day before, giving the religious sanction of the Church to an enterprise that was simultaneously a commercial venture, a political act, and, in the understanding of everyone involved, from King Manuel to the most junior sailor on the Berrio, a crusade of sorts, a continuation of the centuries-long struggle between Christendom and Islam, carried now to new and distant theaters. The crowd that gathered on the shore at Belém to watch the departure was large and emotional by contemporary accounts. Wives and mothers who would not see their husbands and sons again, court officials marking the culmination of decades of preparation, merchants calculating their potential returns, and the merely curious who wanted to see the ships that were going to change the world. 4 vessels stood in the river in the early morning light, the São Gabriel leading, with da Gama on the quarterdeck in the red cross of the Order of Christ that marked him as the fleet's commander.
Behind her, the São Rafael under Paulo da Gama. Then the nimble caravel Berrio under Nicolau Coelho. And last, the lumbering, ungainly store ship, her decks loaded to the waterline with provisions and trade goods that would not be needed until the fleet was deep in the Southern Ocean. As the morning tide ran, the sails filled, the hulls lifted slightly in the river current, and the 4 vessels moved westward past the headland of Restelo and into the Atlantic. For those watching from the shore, they grew smaller and smaller against the blue expanse of the river mouth until they passed the headland and vanished. For the men aboard, the shore receded, Lisbon disappeared behind the hills, and the ocean opened ahead of them. They would not see Portugal again for more than 2 years. Many of them would never see it at all.
The São Gabriel was the most formidable vessel Portugal had ever sent on a voyage of exploration, and the care that had gone into her construction was evident in every detail of her design. She was a carrack, a type of large, high-sided, square-rigged ocean-going ship that had evolved from the earlier Portuguese trading vessels into something that combined carrying capacity with genuine naval power of approximately 170 tons burden, though estimates vary between 120 and 178 tons, depending on how the measurement was made. She had been built in the royal shipyards at Lisbon under the direct supervision of Bartolomeu Dias himself, who specified her dimensions and armament based on his own hard experience of the Cape of Good Hope and the Southern Ocean in 1488, and who was therefore the only man alive who knew from personal experience what conditions the ship would face. Her hull was reinforced with extra timbers at the bow for the punishing head seas of the southern Atlantic and the Cape of Good Hope region. She carried heavy bronze artillery, bombards and culverins mounted on swivel carriages along her sides that gave her more firepower than any vessel she was likely to encounter in the Indian Ocean, where large cannon were still a rarity in most of the maritime traditions the fleet would encounter. And her rigging was a mixture of square sails on the forward masts for running before the trade winds, and lateen sails on the mizzenmast for the close-hauled work in variable coastal conditions. The São Rafael was her near twin in design and armament, built at the same time by the same shipwrights to the same specifications, commanded by Paulo da Gama, with João de Coimbra as pilot. Together, the 2 carracks formed the capital ships of the fleet, its fighting power and its primary carrying capacity. The Berrio was a completely different kind of vessel, a lateen-rigged caravel of 50 to 90 tons, lighter and far more maneuverable than the carracks, capable of working close to shore in shallow waters and of sailing closer to the wind than the larger vessels could manage. She was the fleet's scout and forward observer, sent into harbors and anchorages to test conditions before the carracks committed themselves, and she would prove her value repeatedly in the difficult coastal navigation of the East African shore. Each vessel had its own pilot, its own crew, its own character. Together, they formed a fleet that was far more capable than the sum of its individual parts.
The men who sailed in those 4 vessels numbered between 148 and 170 in total. The records are imprecise, as befits an age before formal crew manifests, and they were drawn from every level of Portuguese society and every branch of the skills the voyage would require. There were experienced deep-water sailors who had served on the West African voyages and knew the Atlantic as well as any men alive. There were gunners trained to manage the bronze artillery that represented Portugal's most decisive military advantage over any naval opposition it was likely to encounter. There were soldiers for the land operations and forced negotiations that were anticipated. There were a surgeon and assistant surgeons whose medicines were the best available, but wholly inadequate against the diseases that would kill 2/3 of the fleet. There were priests to say Mass and hear confession,
and keep the spiritual accounts of men who were going to die in waters no confessor had ever visited. There were scribes to record the voyage, pilots to navigate it, and interpreters to mediate its encounters with the peoples it would meet. 2 Arabic speakers for the Muslim trading cities of East Africa and the Malabar Coast, and 1 interpreter fluent in several Bantu languages for the peoples of the southern African coastline. And then there were the degradados, men condemned to death by Portuguese courts for crimes that had earned them the gallows, whose sentences had been commuted in exchange for service as the expedition's most expendable asset. The degradados were the fleet's advance scouts in the most dangerous sense. They could be put ashore in hostile or unknown ports with instructions to gather intelligence, left to survive or die as the circumstances permitted, their fate of less official concern than that of the pilots and gunners whose skills were irreplaceable. On a voyage of this scale, into waters and political situations of this uncertainty, the degradados served a function that no one in the court would have described openly. They were the human tripwires who could be sacrificed to test the intentions of peoples who might otherwise have tested those intentions on the fleet's officers. The morality of this arrangement was not discussed. It was simply how such expeditions worked. Among those 148 to 170 men, the professionals and the condemned, the experienced and the novice, the believing and the merely obedient, the mortality over the following 2 years would be roughly 2 in every 3. But on the morning of July 8, 1497, as the tide ran and the sails caught the westerly wind and the fleet moved out of the estuary into the sea, the full weight of that future cost was still mercifully invisible, and the mood on the decks was one of prayer, of pride, and of the particular exhilaration of men who know they are going somewhere no one has gone before.
Gdy odwrócił się do swojego młodego syna, jego ruchy były równie oszczędne i kontrolowane. Położył swoją wielką, okutą w rękawice dłoń na drobnym ramieniu chłopca, zaciskając palce tak mocno, że uścisk ten był niemal bolesny, przekazując mu w tym jednym niemym geście cały ciężar rodowego dziedzictwa, obowiązek dumy i absolutny nakaz ukrywania słabości przed światem, skutecznie maskując niewypowiedzianą, szarpiącą duszę agonię człowieka, który wiedział, że może już nigdy nie zobaczyć twarzy swojego dziecka. Ostatnim aktem tej monumentalnej tragedii było wejście na pokład. Skrzypiące, nieszczelne łodzie wiosłowe powoli odrywały się od brzegu, przewożąc dowódców i marynarzy do oczekującej na środku rzeki armady, której niewiarygodna, przytłaczająca skana zapierała dech w piersiach, gdy w milczeniu spoglądali na gigantyczne, strome kadłuby São Gabriel, São Rafael, Berlio i potężnego statku zaopatrzeniowego, górujące nad wodą niczym drewniane fortece nie do zdobycia. Nagle, na stanowczy, potężny okrzyk Vasco, cała ta martwa struktura ożyła w szaleńczym, doskonale zorganizowanym chaosie mechanicznej pracy. Setki szorstkich, krwawiących od wysiłku rąk rzuciło się do obsługi ciężkich kołowrotów, potężne liny naprężyły się do granic wytrzymałości, a dębowe maszty zaczęły niepokojąco trzeszczeć, gdy gigantyczne płócienne żagle zaczęły pnąć się w górę, uwalniając się z objęć powrosów. Gdy potężny poranny wiatr z siłą uderzenia młota wpadł w rozpostarte potężne płótna, na których widniał jaskrawy, krwisto-czerwony krzyż zakonu Chrystusa, potężny São Gabriel gwałtownie szarpnął do przodu z głuchym, przerażającym stęknięciem całego kadłuba, a siła tego ruchu zrzuciła kilku nieostrożnych marynarzy z nóg, sygnalizując ostateczny, bezpowrotny początek najniebezpieczniejszej podróży w historii ludzkości. Gdy 4 tytaniczne okręty nabrały prędkości, spływając w dół szerokiego ujścia Tagu, fizyczny wysiłek i podzałogi mieszali się z łzami, a w miarę jak oddalali się od bezpiecznego, piaszczystego brzegu, ogłuszający do tej pory rozpaczliwy ryk wielotysięcznego tłumu na brzegu zaczął powoli blednąć, zlewając się z szumem wiatru, aż w końcu zamienił się w ledwie słyszalny, odległy szmer, przytłumiony przez rosnący ryk morskich fal, uderzających o drewniane dzioby. Środowisko wokół nich ulegało gwałtownej, przerażającej transformacji. Bezpieczne, muliste i brunatne wody rzeki ustąpiły miejsca gęstemu, groźnemu, nasyconemu granatowi głębokiego Oceanu Atlantyckiego, którego potężne, chłodne tchnienie zaczęło wdzierać się pod ubrania, a linia brzegowa Portugalii stawała się coraz węższym, zamazanym paskiem ziemi na horyzoncie, oznaczającym koniec znanego świata i początek przerażającej, nieodgadnionej otchłani. Gdy słońce zaczęło w końcu chować się za ciemną linią horyzontu, barwiąc wodę na kolor krwawej miedzi, Vasco da Gama stanął zupełnie sam na najwyższym punkcie rufy, całkowicie odizolowany od swoich ludzi i swojego dawnego życia, czując z przerażającą jasnością głębokie, miażdżące poczucie absolutnej alienacji, wiedząc, że od tej pory jego jedynymi sprzymierzeńcami w walce z ciemnością będą jedynie zimna geometria gwiazd, surowa dyscyplina i niewzruszona kamienna wola, która nigdy nie może ulec złamaniu.
Chapter 4. The Great Atlantic Loop. The Volta de Mar carried to its absolute limit.
From Lisbon, the fleet sailed south to the Canary Islands, making a brief call for water and fresh provisions, and then continued to Santiago in the Cape Verde Islands, Portugal's last Atlantic outpost before the open ocean. At Santiago, they spent several days taking on provisions, transferring the remaining stores from the supply ship to the 3 fighting vessels, and making whatever final adjustments to rigging and caulking the pilots deemed necessary before the longest and most uncertain passage any of them had ever attempted. From Santiago, it was possible to look south and east toward the African coast, clearly visible, not far away, and to see the apparently logical route, follow the coast south, as every previous expedition had done, working down the bulge of West Africa and through the doldrums and into the trade winds that would eventually carry the fleet to the latitude of the Cape. Every Portuguese navigator who had pushed south along the African coast in the past 60 years had followed that route, and every one of them had paid a heavy price for it. The South Atlantic high-pressure system that sits off the coast of West Africa generates headwinds and adverse currents along virtually the entire stretch from the Cape Verde Islands to the Cape of Good Hope, and the doldrums near the equator could pin a sailing ship in place for weeks, windless and sweltering, before the trades reasserted themselves. Bartolomeu Dias had barely fought his way through the South Atlantic on his 1488 voyage by sheer persistence, suffering terribly in the process. Da Gama and Pero de l'Alenquer chose a radically different strategy, one that was not an improvisation, but a carefully considered application of principles that Portuguese navigators had been developing for decades in the North Atlantic, scaled up to a magnitude that no one had previously dared attempt. Rather than following the African coast southward into the adverse wind system, Da Gama turned the fleet away from Africa entirely, driving southwest and then south and then southeast in a vast clockwise arc across the open South Atlantic. The logic was elegant. If the winds along the African coast blow against you, sail far enough west to get around the south side of the high-pressure system. Pick up the westerlies of the higher southern latitudes and let them carry you east and southeast toward the Cape. The strategy was well understood in theory. It was an extension of the Volta do Mar technique that Portuguese navigators had used for decades in the North Atlantic, scaled up to a magnitude that no one had previously dared attempt. Rather than following the African coast southward into the adverse wind system, Da Gama turned the fleet away from Africa entirely, driving southwest and then south and then southeast in a vast clockwise arc across the open South Atlantic. The logic was elegant. If the winds along the African coast blow against you, sail far enough west to get around the south side of the high-pressure system. Pick up the westerlies of the higher southern latitudes and let them carry you east and southeast toward the Cape. The strategy was well understood in theory. It was an extension of the volta do mar technique that Portuguese navigators had used for decades in the North Atlantic. But applying it to the South Atlantic on this scale required a confidence in the wind system's regularity that only accumulated experience could provide, and a willingness to lose sight of land for a period of time that no European fleet had previously contemplated. For 93 days, from the first week of August until November 1st, 1497, da Gama's fleet saw no land. More than 10,000 kilometers of open ocean, navigated entirely by dead reckoning and celestial observation, without a single fixed reference point except the positions of the sun at noon and the southern stars at night. The fleet swept as far west as the longitude of present-day Rio de Janeiro before the westerly winds of the high southern latitudes caught the sails and curved the course back east toward the Cape, and the crew felt the temperature drop as the fleet moved south of the tropics into the cold Southern Ocean, and the swells grew longer and heavier, and the Southern Cross climbed higher in the night sky until it was almost overhead. It was the greatest open ocean passage any European fleet had ever made, and it worked exactly as the strategy intended. When the São Gabriel led the fleet around the Cape on November 22, 1497, she was sailing in favorable conditions, not fighting headwinds that might have driven a less boldly routed fleet back north in exhaustion. The Volta do Mar, on a continental scale, had delivered the fleet to the Cape in better condition than any coastal route could have managed.
The psychological weight of those 93 days of open ocean must have been extraordinary, and the Roteiro, the anonymous journal of the voyage written by a crew member, gives fragmentary but vivid evidence of what it cost the men who endured it. The familiar landmarks of Atlantic navigation were left behind one by one, the peak of Tenerife dropping below the horizon, the Cape Verde Islands disappearing astern, and then nothing. No island, no shoal, no changing color of the water indicating approaching land, no coastal birds to reassure the watchkeeper that the world's edge had not been reached. The crew watched the Northern Cross sink toward the horizon as the fleet drove south, watched the Southern Cross rise from beneath the horizon in the south and climb night by night to a position overhead that would have seemed impossible from the latitude of Lisbon. The stars of the northern hemisphere, Polaris, the Great Bear, Cassiopeia, retreated below the northern horizon one by one and were lost, leaving the crew in a sky that no European sailor had ever navigated by, using stars whose positions they had memorized from Abraham Zacuto's tables, but that they were seeing for the first time with their own eyes. The ocean changed in ways that were simultaneously beautiful and frightening. The deep blue of the tropical Atlantic gave way to the gray-green of the Southern Ocean. The trade wind swells shortened and steepened as the fleet moved into the temperate zone. The temperature fell steadily as the latitude increased. Flying fish leaped from the bow wave in the tropics and then disappeared as the water cooled. Albatrosses appeared from the south and circled the masts with their effortless 7-foot wingspans. The sailors, trained to measure their world by proximity to land, were experiencing 3 months of absolute oceanic isolation. No reference point, no safety net, no shore to run to if something went wrong. And the Roteiro hints at the accumulating dread that settled over the fleet as week followed week and nothing appeared on the horizon in any direction. Da Gama held course. Whenever doubts the crew may have harbored, whatever petitions may have been made to the commander to turn east and find the coast, the fleet drove on south and then southeast, trusting to Pero de Alenquer's accumulated knowledge and the mathematics of the wind. When the South African coastline finally materialized on November 1st, 1497, near a bay that would later be named St. Helena Bay, the relief on the 3 ships must have been overwhelming. The relief not just of landfall, but of proof that the navigational gamble had worked,
that the strategy was sound and that the wind system of the South Atlantic behaved as the theory had predicted. They anchored, went ashore, made contact with a small group of San hunter-gatherers trading for ox meat in a meeting that was initially peaceful before da Gama's attempt to take some of the San men aboard as navigational informants provoked a confrontation, and he fired a crossbow and wounded one man. That wounding was the first act of European violence against any indigenous South African, and it set the tone for many of the encounters that followed. Peaceful overture, misunderstanding, and then the automatic resort to force that characterized Portuguese dealings with every people along the coast who refused to cooperate on Portuguese terms. 3 weeks after that first landfall, on November 22, 1497, the fleet rounded the Cape of Good Hope in clear conditions, close enough to the shore for every man on deck to see the great headland clearly. The dark mass of Table Mountain behind it, the Atlantic swells breaking white on the rocks below, and then the coast trending east and the sea opening ahead of them into a new ocean. They had achieved what Dias had achieved 9 years before, and this time they were not going to turn back.
Chapter 5. Around the Cape, into the Indian Ocean.
The rounding of the Cape of Good Hope on November 22, 1497, was the hinge point of the entire voyage, the moment where decades of preparation, 60 years of cumulative Portuguese effort, and the navigational genius of the South Atlantic crossing all converged in a single physical act, sailing around the end of Africa and entering the Indian Ocean. Bartolomeu Dias had named this cape the Cape of Storms after his terrifying encounter with it in 1488, when his 3 small ships had been driven far to the south in a gale that lasted 13 days, and he had rounded the cape without seeing it, emerging on the far side with no certain knowledge of where he was until the coast trended northeast and the sun rose unexpectedly in the north. João II had renamed it the Cape of Good Hope, an act of royal rebranding designed to encourage rather than deter further voyages, and it was under that more optimistic name that da Gama approached it. He rounded it in conditions far less terrible than Dias had experienced, clear enough that the crew could see the cape itself, the great cliffs plunging into the sea where 2 oceans met, and the coast bending east beyond it toward a horizon that no European chart had ever recorded. The moment must have been extraordinary. Every man on deck who understood navigation would have known what it meant. But the Roteiro records it with characteristic brevity. They rounded the cape and sailed east. The emotional content is left to the reader's imagination. From the Cape, the fleet sailed east and then northeast along the South African coast into Mossel Bay, the same bay where Dias had made his first anchorage on the Indian Ocean side of Africa, the same bay where Dias's padrone still stood on the headland, still legible despite 9 years of Cape weather. They anchored in the bay and spent 2 weeks resupplying from their dwindling provisions by trading with the Khoikhoi pastoralists who lived along the shore. Initially with success, the Khoikhoi brought cattle and sheep to the beach and the Portuguese exchanged copper and cloth, and then with increasing tension as misunderstandings accumulated and da Gama's impatience with anything less than full cooperation reasserted itself. There was a confrontation, there was cannon fire, there were Khoikhoi running for the hills. Then da Gama made the decision that was, in retrospect, one of the most symbolically loaded of the entire voyage. He ordered the store ship run aground on the beach and burned. Not salvaged, not left for potential rescue, burned, reduced to timbers and ash, so that nothing usable remained for any rival power that might follow in the fleet's wake. Every provision, every barrel of water, every spar and rope that the store ship still contained was transferred to the 3 fighting vessels. The store ship herself was stripped and destroyed.
The fleet had burned its last bridge to the west. 3 ships now carried everything: the cargo, the provisions, the weapons, the men. Whatever lay ahead had to be faced with what those 3 ships contained and nothing more.
The eastern and northeastern coast of southern Africa, the territory of present-day South Africa, Mozambique, and Tanzania, was completely unknown to European geography in December 1497, though it had been familiar to the Arab and Swahili maritime traders of the Indian Ocean world for many centuries. As the fleet sailed northeast along this uncharted coastline, navigating by sounding and by the cautious observation of shoals and reefs, the sailors observed a landscape that grew progressively more tropical and more densely populated. The scrubby fine boss of the Cape region gave way to subtropical forests crowding to the water's edge, then to river mouths bordered by mangroves, then to the coral reefs and low sandy shores of the Mozambique coast. The crew saw smoke from fires ashore and occasional canoes in the river mouths and the signs of settled habitation along a coast that European cartography had simply rendered as blank space. On December 16, 1497, the fleet reached the Great Fish River, the easternmost point of Bartolomeu Dias's 1488 voyage, marked by a stone padrone that still stood on the headland where Dias had planted it 9 years before. It was weathered by Cape storms and salt spray, but the inscription was legible: the Portuguese royal arms and the date, 1488. Marking the previous generation's limit of knowledge. Passing it, the fleet sailed beyond the edge of every European map ever drawn into completely uncharted waters. The anonymous author of the Rotero records this crossing with a quiet note of significance. They had passed Dias's Padrón, and from here on they were in unknown sea. The fleet proceeded up the Mozambique Channel through January 1498, navigating carefully along a coast that was shoaling in places and scattered with reefs that the pilots had to identify and avoid without any chart to guide them. On January 11, 1498, they anchored in the mouth of the Quelimane River in what is now Mozambique and spent 26 days there, longer than intended, because the crews needed rest and the ships needed repair. Rigging had been chafed and damaged by the months at sea. Hull planking had loosened at the seams. The ground tackle, anchors, and cables had taken punishment in the rough anchorages of the southern Cape coast. More ominously, some of the crew were showing the early symptoms of scurvy, swollen gums, lethargy, old bruises that would not fade. None of the fleet's surgeons understood the cause. Scurvy would not be clinically explained for another 2.5 centuries, but they were beginning to observe the pattern. It came on men who had been long at sea without fresh food, and it improved somewhat when fresh provisions were available. At the Quelimane, they bought or traded for fresh food where they could, and the worst cases showed some improvement. Then they sailed north into the network of Muslim trading cities that was the Indian Ocean world's western shore, a world that would prove both indispensable to their survival and deeply, implacably hostile to their ambitions.
Chapter 6. The Swahili Coast, Malindi, and the pilot Ahmad ibn Majid. The East African coast that da Gama's fleet sailed northward along in February and March 1498 was not a wilderness waiting to be mapped by European navigators. It was the western shore of one of the most sophisticated maritime civilizations in the world, a chain of prosperous city-states that had been trading with India, Arabia, Persia, and China for more than 1,000 years. The Swahili city-states, Mozambique Island, Kilwa, Mombasa, Pate, Malindi, and a dozen others, were built of coral stone, their mosques and warehouses rising behind wharves that received dhows from Calicut and Hormuz and Gujarat on every seasonal monsoon.
Their populations were cosmopolitan mixtures of Bantu African, Arab, and Indian ancestry, speaking the Swahili language that had evolved from the long mixing of African and Arab coastal cultures, and practicing Islam with the deep familiarity of a faith that had been present on this coast for 600 years. The gold of Zimbabwe came down the Zambezi and through Sofala to the coast. Ivory from the elephant-rich interior of East Africa moved through the same channels. Slaves taken in the wars of the interior were another commodity that passed through the Swahili ports outward to the Arab world. In exchange, the seasonal dhow traffic from India and Arabia brought cotton cloth from Gujarat, the most desired textile in sub-Saharan Africa, and porcelain from China, and copper and glass beads from the Persian Gulf, and the 1,000 manufactured goods that the African interior could not produce for itself. The Arab merchants who managed much of this trade were not mere factors for distant employers. They were permanent residents of the Swahili coast, married into local families, embedded in local political structures, possessed of detailed knowledge of both the African interior and the Asian trading world that their dhows connected. When Da Gama's 3 armed carracks appeared off Mozambique Island in early March 1498, firing gun salutes that rattled the windows of the waterfront mosques and flying the unfamiliar Red Cross of the Order of Christ, these Arab merchants understood immediately and with perfect clarity what the Portuguese arrival meant. Not mere traders arriving to participate in the established commercial network, but armed competitors from a distant Christian kingdom whose entire purpose was to bypass the intermediary system that had made the Arab merchants of East Africa wealthy. Their response was accordingly hostile, and it shaped every encounter that the fleet had along the Swahili coast. At Mozambique Island, the Sultan initially mistook the Portuguese for Muslims, a misunderstanding that Da Gama's Arabic-speaking interpreters allowed to persist as long as it was useful, and provided them with 2 pilots to guide the fleet northward along the coast. When the truth of the visitor's identity became clear, the Sultan abruptly withdrew his cooperation and attempted to reclaim the pilots. Da Gama refused, and when the Sultan organized armed canoes to recapture the pilots by force, Da Gama turned the São Gabriel's cannon on the town and bombarded it from the harbor. The bombardment achieved its immediate tactical purpose. The canoes withdrew, but it also announced to every port on the Swahili coast exactly what the Portuguese represented. Not diplomats, but heavily armed aggressors whose firepower was sufficient to destroy any shore installation that stood in their way. The news of the bombardment of Mozambique reached Mombasa before Da Gama did, and the reception there reflected the knowledge. The Arab merchants of Mombasa organized a reception that was outwardly courteous and inwardly a trap, using the apparent welcome to try to lure the Portuguese ships into the harbor, where shoals and armed men could be deployed against them. Da Gama saw through the deception. Accounts differ on how, some saying he applied torture to prisoners to extract the truth, and withdrew in time, the fleet's cannon covering the retreat. The Swahili coast, 3 months into the Indian Ocean leg of the voyage, was entirely hostile, and the fleet was running short of pilots who knew the waters ahead. At Malindi, 40 kilometers north of Mombasa, the political calculation that governed the Sultan's response to the Portuguese arrival was entirely different from anything the fleet had encountered at Mozambique or Mombasa, and the change in atmosphere was immediate and transformative. The Sultan of Malindi had been locked for decades in a commercial and territorial rivalry with the Sultan of Mombasa. The 2 cities competed for the same trade routes, the same merchant communities, and the same political influence along the northern Kenyan coast. And the arrival of a Portuguese fleet whose cannon had already demonstrated its ability to reduce coastal fortifications to rubble was, from the Malindi Sultan's perspective, a diplomatic windfall of the first order. Portuguese cannon pointed at Mombasa from the shelter of Malindi's harbor was an asset of incalculable value to a ruler who had been unable to prevail over his rival through ordinary means. The Sultan came out to Da Gama's ship in a royal barge, brought fresh provisions, oranges, the accounts note, and the scurvy-ridden members of the crew began to recover almost visibly as soon as the citrus arrived, and engaged in a week of ceremonies and gift exchanges that established a formal alliance between Malindi and Portugal. Then, having secured his political objective, the Sultan provided Da Gama with the single most valuable thing in the Indian Ocean, a pilot who knew the route to India. The identity of this pilot has been disputed by historians for more than 5 centuries. A later Portuguese tradition identified him with Ahmed ibn Majid, the greatest Arab navigator of the 15th century, whose treatise on Indian Ocean navigation, the Fawaid fi Usul Ilm al-Bahr, was the most comprehensive sailing guide to Asian waters ever written in Arabic, and whose knowledge of the monsoon winds, the coastal configuration of the Malabar coast, and the hazards of the Indian Ocean crossing was encyclopedic. Modern scholars doubt this identification. Ibn Majid was by 1498 an old man, the dates do not align well, and no Arabic source confirms that he served as Da Gama's pilot. The man was almost certainly a Gujarati Muslim, a pilot from the western coast of India who had been trading between Malindi and Calicut for years and who knew the Indian Ocean crossing as well as he knew the streets of his home port. What is beyond dispute is what this unnamed pilot carried in his head, the complete, detailed, empirically verified knowledge of the Indian Ocean wind system that had been accumulated over centuries of Arab and Gujarati ocean sailing, including the precise timing and character of the southwest monsoon that blows from Africa toward India between May and September, the latitude of the Malabar coast, the position of the major ports, the underwater hazards along the final approach to Calicut, and the seasonal window, the weeks in late April and early May, in which the monsoon was just establishing itself with enough strength and consistency to carry a fleet across 1,200 miles of open ocean in a single sustained passage. The fleet departed Malindi on April 24, 1498, with this pilot standing at the bow of the São Gabriel, his eyes on a sea he had crossed many times before, guiding an expedition he cannot have fully understood toward a destination whose consequences he certainly could not have imagined. 23 days later, 23 days compared with the 93 days of the South Atlantic crossing, 23 days of clean, fast sailing before a favorable monsoon, the crew of the São Gabriel smelled land on the evening wind, saw birds on the water, saw the color of the sea change from deep blue to green-gray, and on May 20th, 1498, dropped anchor off the Indian port of Kapadu, just north of Kozhikode on the Malabar coast. They had arrived. The sea route to India was real, and they were the first Europeans ever to have sailed it.
Chapter 7. Calicut, the city of spices, and the hostile Zamorin.
The arrival of Da Gama's fleet off the Malabar coast of India on May 20th, 1498 was one of the most consequential moments in world history, the culmination of 60 years of Portuguese effort, the proof of a navigational theory that had seemed impossibly ambitious when it was first conceived, and the opening of a chapter in human affairs whose consequences are still being lived with today. The port city of Kozhikode, Calicut to European ears, the name that would become synonymous with India itself in European imagination, was in 1498 one of the greatest commercial cities on earth,
a metropolis of tens of thousands of people whose waterfront was lined with warehouses holding pepper and cinnamon and ginger and cardamom, whose harbor was crowded with the lateen sails of Arab dhows and the square sails of Gujarati trading vessels and the enormous multi-masted junks of Chinese merchants, whose bazaars rang with the sound of a dozen languages, and whose narrow streets were thick with the smell of spices drying on rooftops and in open-sided sheds along the waterfront. The entire commercial apparatus of the Indian Ocean spice trade, the trade that had sustained the wealth of Venice and Genoa and Alexandria and Cairo and a dozen Arab trading cities for 1,000 years, funneled through this city, moving outward in Arab dhows to the Red Sea and Persian Gulf, inward from the pepper gardens of the Malabar hinterland to the warehouses on the waterfront. It was, by any measure, the prize at the end of the route. The city was governed by the Zamorin, a Sanskrit title, Samudri Raja, meaning Lord of the Sea, a Hindu ruler of the Nair caste, whose political authority rested on his ability to maintain a delicate and constantly shifting balance of power among the many merchant communities whose taxes and commercial activity sustained his kingdom. The Arab merchants, primarily from the Malabar Muslim community of Mapula traders with strong connections to Arabia and the Persian Gulf, were the most numerous and commercially powerful single group in Calicut, and their relationship with the Zamorin was one of mutual dependence. They needed his protection and his harbor, and he needed his commercial expertise and his connections to the Indian Ocean trading network. There were also large communities of Hindu, Nair, and Banya merchants, Tamil traders from the Coromandel coast, Gujarati merchants, and smaller communities from Persia, China, and Southeast Asia. Calicut was, in the most literal sense, a world city, a place where the commercial systems of 3 continents converged and exchanged. Into this sophisticated, well-established, multiply interconnected world, Da Gama arrived in 3 armed ships carrying trade goods that were adequate for West Africa and letters from a king that no one in Calicut had ever heard of, and he attempted to negotiate a commercial treaty as the representative of an equal power. The gap between the pretension and the reality was staggering, and the Zamorin's court, well-informed, commercially sophisticated, advised by Arab merchants who understood exactly what Portuguese commercial ambitions meant for their own position, was not disposed to pretend it didn't exist. Da Gama was received in audience, granted the ceremonies appropriate to a foreign visitor of uncertain status, and presented with a politely but firmly skeptical audience that would, over the following weeks, reveal the full extent of the obstacles that stood between Portuguese ambitions and Indian commercial reality.
The formal audience with the Zamorin was conducted in a palace of considerable magnificence through interpreters who translated between Portuguese and Arabic, and then between Arabic and Malayalam, with all the distortions and diplomatic nuances that 3-language interpretation inevitably introduces. Da Gama presented himself as the ambassador of a great Christian king who sought friendship and commerce. The Zamorin received him with the measured courtesy he extended to any visitor of apparent significance. And then the gifts were produced. They had been packed in Lisbon by officials who knew Africa and knew what had impressed the chiefs of Guinea and the Congo coast: scarlet cloth, woolen hats, strings of coral, jars of oil and honey and sugar. When Da Gama's servants laid them out before the Zamorin's court, the reaction was a disaster. The Zamorin's courtiers, accustomed to the finest silks and brocades of Chinese and Gujarati manufacture, to rubies from Burma and pearls from the Gulf and diamonds from the Deccan, looked at the Portuguese offerings with visible contempt, and some accounts say they laughed openly. The Arab merchants of Calicut, who had been watching the Portuguese arrival with the alarm of businessmen watching a competitor enter their market, moved immediately to exploit the humiliation.
They had already told the Zamorin that the newcomers were almost certainly pirates rather than royal ambassadors, a reasonable inference since genuine royal ambassadors did not arrive at the courts of great rulers with cloth and beads, and the inadequacy of the gifts seemed to confirm their assessment. They pressed the Zamorin to refuse da Gama any commercial privileges, to deny him the right to leave a Portuguese factor in the city, to require that he pay customs duties in gold like any ordinary merchant, and to treat his visit as a commercial transaction rather than a diplomatic occasion. The Zamorin was persuaded. Over the following weeks, every substantive request that da Gama made was either refused outright or hedged with conditions that made fulfillment impossible. The right to establish a trading factory, denied. The exemption from customs duties that an ambassador would receive, denied. Permission to purchase spices without the involvement of Arab intermediaries, technically permitted but practically obstructed. Da Gama managed through direct private negotiations with individual merchants who were willing to sell outside the established system, to purchase a modest cargo of pepper and cinnamon, enough to fill a fraction of the São Gabriel's hold, but enough to demonstrate that the trade was commercially viable. It was not the treaty of commerce he had been sent to negotiate, but it was proof of the route's potential, and that proof was, in the end, what the expedition had been sent to find. The departure was as contentious as the arrival had been. When da Gama attempted to leave, the Zamorin detained several of his men, apparently as surety for the customs duties that da Gama had declined to pay in full. Da Gama retaliated by seizing a group of the Zamorin's officials, port administrators who had come aboard the São Gabriel on routine business, and holding them hostage against the return of his men. The standoff lasted for days, with the Arab merchants urging the Zamorin to hold firm, and da Gama's own crew growing increasingly anxious about the position they were in, anchored in a foreign harbor surrounded by a population that viewed them with hostility. Eventually, an exchange of hostages was arranged. The Zamorin's men returned for da Gama's men, and on August 29, 1498, the 3 Portuguese ships weighed anchor and sailed out of Calicut's harbor for the last time. They had been in India for 3 months. They had failed to secure a commercial treaty, failed to leave a resident factor, and failed to convert the Zamorin's initial neutral curiosity into anything resembling goodwill. What they carried in their holds was a small cargo of pepper and cinnamon, and the knowledge, absolutely certain now, that the sea route to India was real, that the spice trade was accessible, and that the next fleet that came, larger, better armed, better equipped with appropriate gifts, would be in a position to demand what this one could only request.
Chapter 8. The Price of Pepper. What the Voyage Cost and Won.
The return voyage from India to Portugal was the most terrible ordeal the fleet had yet endured, and it transformed a voyage of triumphant navigation into a passage through something approaching hell. Departing Calicut on August 29, 1498, the fleet attempted to recross the Indian Ocean westward toward East Africa, but the monsoon winds had shifted against them. The northeast monsoon, which blows steadily from India toward Africa between November and March, had not yet established itself with any consistency, and the crossing that had taken 23 days in May, riding the southwest monsoon at its peak, now became a 3-month nightmare of contrary winds, dead calms, torrential rain, and the building catastrophe of scurvy. The disease had been building in the crew's bodies for more than a year, since the last reliable supply of fresh food at the Cape Verde Islands in July 1497. Vitamin C deficiency does not announce itself immediately. It accumulates silently over weeks and months as the body depletes its stored reserves and begins to lose its ability to synthesize the collagen that holds connective tissue together.
By late 1498, the crew of all 3 ships had been on preserved food, salt beef, salt fish, dried legumes, ship's biscuit, and whatever fresh provisions they had been able to buy or barter at the ports along the way for more than 15 months, and the reserves were exhausted. Now the disease erupted with full force. Gums blackened and swelled until men could not eat the salt meat that was all they had to eat. Teeth loosened and fell out into the sailors' hands. Old wounds and old fractures that had healed months before opened along their original lines as the collagen in the scar tissue dissolved. Joints swelled to grotesque proportions and became so painful that men who had been climbing rigging 3 weeks before now lay in the lowest parts of the ship, unable to bear the motion that was unavoidable at sea. The affected men developed the haunted, hollow-eyed look of the severely vitamin deficient, their skin turning yellow and covered with bruises that appeared for no reason and refused to fade. More than 30 men died during the Indian Ocean crossing alone, 30 bodies committed to the deep Indian Ocean, on top of the dozens already lost on the outward passage. And by the time the fleet finally sighted the East African coast near Malindi in early January 1499, the combined crews of 3 ships could barely muster enough able-bodied men to sail 2. Da Gama took the measure of what remained to him with the cold arithmetic that characterized his decision-making at every moment of crisis. The São Rafael was short-handed, her remaining crew insufficient to maintain a proper watch rotation over a passage of several months. He ordered her grounded on the beach, stripped of everything useful, cannon, rigging, provisions, all the equipment that could be transferred, and then burned. Paulo da Gama, her commander since Lisbon, who had captained her across the South Atlantic and the Indian Ocean and back, lay gravely ill below decks on the São Gabriel. From his sickbed he watched, or perhaps was too far gone to watch, as the ship he had commanded was reduced to ash on an East African beach. The crew was distributed between the São Gabriel and the Berrio. Now there were 2 ships where there had been 4, and enough men between them to crew both if carefully organized, and if the passage home involved no further catastrophic losses. At Malindi, they rested, ate fresh food, recovered what little vitality the scurvy survivors could recover without a full course of citrus, and then turned south toward the Cape and home. Of the 148 to 170 men who had sailed from the mouth of the Tagus on a Sunday morning in July 1497, somewhere between 54 and 55 returned alive to Portugal. 2 ships of 4 completed the voyage. The mortality rate was approximately 2/3, a devastation that should be allowed to register in full before the commercial and geographical triumph is celebrated, because those 2/3 were individual human beings with names and families and the specific, irreplaceable experience of having sailed somewhere no one had sailed before. And they died in circumstances of considerable suffering, far from home, in service of commercial ambitions whose benefits they would never see. The Berrio, under Nicolau Coelho, arrived at Lisbon in late July 1499, the first of the fleet's vessels to complete the voyage, the first to bring the news back to Portugal, the first to confirm what 2 years of waiting and prayer had been directed toward. The fleet had reached India. The sea route was real. The spice trade was within Portugal's grasp. Da Gama followed weeks later, and his return was shadowed with grief. Paulo da Gama, his older brother and the commander of the São Rafael, had been growing steadily weaker throughout the return voyage. His illness, perhaps tuberculosis, perhaps some combination of diseases acquired over 2 years at sea, advancing past any remedy the fleet surgeons could offer. Vasco had arranged for Paulo to be transferred from the São Gabriel to a faster vessel at the Cape Verde Islands, trying to get him home to Portugal before he died. The effort failed. Paulo da Gama died on the island of Terceira in the Azores, within sight of the Portuguese horizon, as his brother Vasco kept vigil beside him. a grief that the normally implacable commander apparently felt with an intensity that surprised those around him, who had seen him ordered burnings and bombardments without visible emotion, but who now watched him sit by his brother's deathbed for days before continuing the final passage to Lisbon. Da Gama's entry into Lisbon was not the triumphant procession the city had prepared for. It was the arrival of a man who had done what he had been sent to do, at a cost he was still absorbing. King Manuel received him with all the honors the crown could bestow. The small cargo of pepper and cinnamon in the São Gabriel's hold, a fraction of what later fleets would carry, but more Asian spice than had ever before arrived in Lisbon by any route, was sold on the Lisbon market, and the profit it generated covered a substantial portion of the expedition's total cost. This was the proof that mattered most to the merchants in the crown, not just that the route existed, but that it was commercially viable, that the ratio of cost to return was favorable, that the scale of the operation could be increased and the profits multiplied indefinitely. Manuel did not wait to enjoy the first voyage's success. He immediately began assembling the follow-up expedition. 13 ships, 1,200 men, Pedro Alvarez Cabral in command, with enough firepower to make commercial demands that no Zamorin could dismiss with a courtier's contemptuous laugh. Cabral's fleet would accidentally discover Brazil on the outward passage, a landfall so far west that the fleet touched the coast of South America while following da Gama's great Atlantic arc, and then continue to Calicut, where the murder of Portuguese factors who had been left ashore would trigger a naval bombardment of the city that destroyed the Arab quarter and inaugurated the century of violence that is the Indian Ocean's true memorial to Vasco da Gama's voyage. The Estado da India, the Portuguese administrative apparatus that would eventually control trading posts and fortified bases from East Africa through India to the Spice Islands of the Moluccas, was built on the navigational achievement of 1497 and the military violence of everything that followed. It made Portugal briefly the most commercially powerful nation in Europe, broke the Venetian spice monopoly, shifted the center of European commercial gravity from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, and set in motion the centuries of colonial enterprise and oceanic commerce that would eventually, 400 years on, produce the integrated global economy we inhabit today. Vasco da Gama died in India in December 1524 on his third voyage, serving as Viceroy of Portuguese India, in the city he had first struggled to reach, governing the empire his voyage had made possible, buried eventually in the Jerónimos monastery in Lisbon that Manuel had built from the profits of the trade da Gama had opened. The Portuguese national epic Luís de Camões Os Lusíadas takes his voyage as its central subject and its highest celebration. The full reckoning of what that voyage cost in the lives lost on the São Gabriel and the São Rafael and the Berrio, in the peoples of the Indian Ocean world who would spend a century under Portuguese commercial violence, in the centuries of colonial history that followed from the trail it blazed, belongs to a longer and still unfinished story. But it begins, as it must, with 4 small ships and one iron-willed man from Sines, who sailed south into the unknown and refused at every turn to come back empty-handed.
Chapter 9. The Treachery of Mombasa.
Płynąc na północ wzdłuż surowego afrykańskiego wybrzeża, portugalska flotylla, zmęczona i zdesperowana, poszukiwała nie tylko zaopatrzenia, ale przede wszystkim pilota zdolnego poprowadzić ich przez zdradzieckie wody Oceanu Indyjskiego w stronę upragnionych Indii. Vasco da Gama, stojąc na pokładzie flagowego okrętu São Gabriel, wpatrywał się w horyzont wzrokiem ciężkim od podejrzeń, a jego twarz, oświetlona ostrym, równikowym słońcem, przypominała rzeźbę wykutą w ciemnym kamieniu. Wspomnienia niedawnych zdrad w Mozambiku wciąż paliły jego umysł, zatruwając każdą myśl o potencjalnych sojusznikach i zamieniając naturalną ciekawość odkrywcie w paranoiczną czujność. Z każdym przebytym milomorskim dystansem drewniane kadłuby statków trzeszczały z wysiłku, żagle, niegdyś śnieżno-białe z dumnym czerwonym krzyżem zakonu Chrystusa, teraz przypominały wypłowiałe, poszarpane przez sztormy całuny. Zapach zbutwiałego drewna, słonej wilgoci i niemytego potu załogi mieszał się z duszącym, gorącym powietrzem, tworząc atmosferę fizycznego i psychicznego wyczerpania. Kiedy w oddali zarysowały się potężne, jasne mury Mombasy, miasta znacznie potężniejszego i bogatszego niż cokolwiek, co do tej pory widzieli na tym wybrzeżu, w sercach żeglarzy obudziła się mieszanka podziwu i głębokiego lęku. Mombasa nie była jedynie kolejną osadą, była prawdziwą fortecą, perłą handlu, której strzeliste minarety i solidne kamienne fortyfikacje rzucały długie, złowieszcze cienie na spokojne wody zatoki. Słońce, powoli chylące się ku zachodowi, malowało niebo w odcieniach głębokiego, rdzawego brązu i burzowej szarości, podczas gdy woda w porcie odbijała światło niczym roztopiony ołów, tworząc scenerię niemal apokaliptyczną w swoim ciężkim, przytłaczającym pięknie. Da Gama wiedział, że wejście do tego portu to wejście do jaskini lwa, ale desperacja pchała go naprzód. Bez pilota ich misja była skazana na porażkę, a Indie na zawsze pozostałyby jedynie nieosiągalnym, mglistym snem. Każda deska na pokładzie São Gabriel zdawała się pulsować napięciem, gdy żeglarze z twarzami umazanymi smołą i solą z niepokojem obserwowali zbliżające się kontury lądu. Wiatr, który wcześniej łagodnie pchał ich ku północy, teraz wydawał się nieść ze sobą zapach egzotycznych przypraw, ale też niewypowiedzianego zagrożenia, zapach krwi i zdrady, który Da Gama nauczył się już rozpoznawać na tym niegościnnym kontynencie. Chaoskoro von Mur tworzyło na powierzchni oceanu plamy mroku i oślepiającego światła, potęgując wrażenie niepewności i zbliżającego się dramatu. Kapitan, otulony w swój ciężki wełniany płaszcz, pomimo równikowego upału, milczał, a jego zaciśnięte pięści spoczywające na rzeźbionej balustradzie zdradzały wewnętrzną walkę między obowiązkiem a instynktem przetrwania. Wpłynięcie do rozległego portu Mombasy było spektaklem oszałamiającym zmysły, a zarazem budzącym głęboki, paraliżujący niepokój w szeregach portugalskiej załogi, która z pokładów swoich zniszczonych karawel obserwowała potęgę sułtanatu. Zatoka roiła się od dziesiątek, jeśli nie setek tradycyjnych łodzi dału, których trójkątne żagle łopotały na wietrze niczym skrzydła drapieżych ptaków, krzyżując się w chaotycznym, lecz precyzyjnie kontrolowanym tańcu na wodzie. Sułtan Mombasy, zawiadomiony o przybyciu tajemniczych, obcych okrętów, szybko zinscenizował powitanie, które w swojej wystawności miało uśpić czujność zmęczonych żeglarzy i wciągnąć ich do starannie przygotowanej pułapki. Z miasta wyruszyły bogato zdobione łodzie, z których dobiegały dźwięki bębnów i egzotycznych instrumentów dętych, a na ich pokładach znalezieni się wysłannicy odzieni w jedłabia o barwach tak nasyconych i wibrujących, że wydawały się niemal nierealne na tle szarych, zniszczonych wiatrem burt portugalskich statków. Delegacja przywiozła ze sobą dary o nieoszacowanej wartości dla głodującej załogi. Kosze pełne dojrzałych, soczystych cytrusów, których słodki zapach natychmiast wypełnił duszące, gorące powietrze około okrętów, trzcinę cukrową, świeże mięso.
Chapter 10. Niezwykły sojusz w Malindi.
Ciężkie, ołowiane chmury wisiały nisko nad horyzontem, gdy potargane wiatrem i wyblakłe od soli żagle portugalskiej armady z trudem łapały słabnące kodmuchy bryzy. Powietrze było gęste, wilgotne i przesycone zapachem gnijącego drewna oraz powolnej, nieuniknionej śmierci, która niczym niewidzialny pasażer zadomowiła się pod pokładami okrętów. Po brutalnych, pełnych zdrady i rozlewu krwi doświadczeniach w Mozambiku i Mombasie, załoga okrętu flagowego São Gabriel znajdowała się na skraju absolutnego wyczerpania fizycznego i całkowitego załamania nerwowego. Vasco da Gama, stojąc na rufie z dłońmi zaciśniętymi na szorstkiej, wyżłobionej przez morskie żywioły balustradzie, wpatrywał się w majaczącą w oddali linię brzegową z napięciem graniczącym z kliniczną paranoją. Jego twarz, oświetlona jedynie bladym, sączącym się przez chmury światłem, przypominała rzeźbę wykutą z ciemnego kamienia, pełną ostrych, głębokich cieni, potęgujących wrażenie surowości i nieustępliwości. Każde skrzypienie kadłuba, każde uderzenie fali o spękane deski brzmiało w jego uszach jak preludium do kolejnej zasadzki. Wiedział, że jego ludzie, trawieni przez potworne stadium szkorbutu z krwawiącymi dziąsłami i poczerniałymi z martwicy ciałami, nie przetrwają kolejnego starcia z wrogą flotą. Zbliżali się do Malindi, kolejnego potężnego portu na wschodnim wybrzeżu Afryki, a w sercach marynarzy nie było nadziei, lecz jedynie tępy, znieczulający strach przed ostatecznym końcem w obcej, niegościnnej ziemi. Kontrast między przerażającym stanem załogi, a majestatycznym widokiem wyłaniającego się z mgły białego miasta był niemal bolesny. Malindi z jego jasnymi, wapiennymi murami i smukłymi minaretami, odbijającymi rzadkie promienie słońca, wyglądało jak fata morgana obiecująca raj, w który żaden z doświadczonych przez zdradę Portugalczyków nie miał już odwagi uwierzyć. Dowódca wydał ciche, chropawe rozkazy. Działa zostały naładowane, a puszkarze z twarzami ukrytymi w mroku dolnych pokładów stanęli przy swoich pozycjach z tlącymi się lątami. Światło bijące od żarących się sznurów rzucało na ich spocone, brudne twarze karawagiowskie blaski, wydobywając z ciemności napięte mięśnie i blysk zdesperowanych oczu. Zaantkwiczyli w bezpiecznej odległości od brzegu, poza zasięgiem ewentualnych baterii lądowych, gotowi w każdej chwili odrąbać liny cumownicze i podjąć nierówną walkę o przetrwanie. Cisza, która zapadła po rzuceniu kotwic, była ciężka jak ołów. Był to ten rodzaj napiętej, wibrującej ciszy, która poprzedza uderzenie pioruna. Marynarze oparci o zwoje szorstkich lin wpatrywali się w port, oczekując widoku wojennych dołów, zbrojnych z łucznikami i wojownikami. Jednak ku ich narastającemu zdumieniu, pierwsza łódź, która oderwała się od brzegu i zaczęła ciąć głęboki, granatowy lazur wód zatoki, nie miała na pokładzie żołnierzy. Była to niewielka, elegancka jednostka, na której dziobie powiewały barwne proporcje, a pasażerowie ubrani byli w bogate, jedwabne szaty o nasyconych barwach, które brutalnie kontrastowali z wyblakłymi, zgaszonymi brązami i szarościami portugalskich karaweli. Da Gama obserwował zbliżających się emisariuszy z mroczną, nieodgadnioną furią w oczach, analizując każdy ich ruch. Podejrzewał najgorsze. Kolejny podstęp, zatrute dary, próbę uśpienia ich czujności przed nocnym atakiem. Kiedy posłańcy weszli na pokład, przynieśli ze sobą dary, które w oczach wygłodniałej załogi miały wartość większą niż złoto Inków. Były tam świeże owce, egzotyczne przysprawy rozsiewające oszałamiający zapach po zbutwiałym pokładzie oraz kosze pełne cytrusów. Mimo tego widoku kapitan generalny nie drgnął, a jego dłoń spoczywała na głowicy zdobionego rapiera. Dopiero przez tłumaczy, w doku powolnej i ostrożnej wymiany zdań, zaczęła przed nim odsłaniać się skomplikowana sieć lokalnej geopolityki. Okazało się, że sułtan Malindi był zaciekłym, śmiertelnym wrogiem władcy Mombasy. Widząc na horyzoncie potężne, uzbrojone w ciężkie działa okręty, które przedarły się przez wody,
Chapter 11. The Guiding Star of Ibn Majid.
Pałac sułtana w Malindi tonął w gęstym, niemal namacalnym mroku, który rozcinały jedynie wąskie snopy słonecznego światła wpadające przez kunsztownie rzeźbione drewniane żaluzje. W tym dusznym, przysyconym zapachem kadzidła, mirry i egzotycznych przypraw wnętrzu Vasco da Gama czekał z rosnącą niecierpliwością, a jego ciężka, naznaczona rdzą i morską solą zbroja wydawała się całkowicie nie na miejscu pośród miękkich, jedwabnych poduszek i bogatych tapiserii. Atmosfera przypominała płótna mistrzów światłocienia. Głębokie, dramatyczne cienie spowijały kąty komnaty, podczas gdy ostre światło wydobywało z mroku surową, napiętą twarz portugalskiego dowódcy. Da Gama był człowiekiem czynu, żołnierzem przywykłym do brutalnej walki z falami i wiatrem, a teraz, u progu największej tajemnicy swojego życia, zmuszony był do bezczynności. Za oknami pałacu rozciągał się Ocean Indyjski, bezkresna, przerażająca otchłań, która dla Europejczyków pozostawała zamkniętą księgą pełną potworów i śmiertelnych niebezpieczeństw. Sułtan złożył obietnicę, że dostarczy mu przewodnika, człowieka, który zna te wody lepiej niż ktokolwiek inny na świecie, lecz każda mijająca sekunda potęgowała w Portugalczyku naturalną nieufność i sceptycyzm. Jego dłoń w szorstkiej, skórzanej rękawicy instynktownie spoczywała na rękojeści miecza, gotowa do dobycia broni przy najmniejszym znaku zdrady, podczas gdy jego umysł trawiły wątpliwości, czy jakikolwiek człowiek jest w stanie ujarzmić ten obcy, groźny żywioł, który oddzielał ich od wymarzonych Indii. Nagle ciężkie, nabijane mosiądzem drzwi komnaty otworzyły się z cichym, przeciągłym skrzypieniem, a do środka wkroczyła postać, która natychmiast zmieniła gęstość powietrza w pomieszczeniu. To nie był zwykły pilot nabrzeżny, wyciągnięty z portowej tawerny, lecz Ahmad ibn Majid, żywa legenda Oceanu Indyjskiego, mistrz nawigacji, astronom i autor niezliczonych traktatów o sztuce żeglarskiej. Zjawisko to przypominało wejście monarchy do sali tronowej. Ibn Majid poruszał się z niespieszną, pełną godności gracją, a jego szaty w odcieniach głębokiego oceanicznego błękitu i spłowiałych ziemistych brązów szeleściły cicho przy każdym kroku, kontrastując z topornym brzękiem portugalskiej stali. Twarz Araba była mapą samą w sobie, wyrzeźbioną przez dekady wiatrów, solowego sprayu i bezlitosnego równikowego słońca. Głębokie zmarszczki wokół oczu świadczyły o latach wpatrywania się w horyzont i nocne niebo, a jego spojrzenie było ostre, analityczne i całkowicie pozbawione strachu. Spotkanie tych dwóch mężczyzn było zderzeniem dwóch zupełnie odmiennych światów, dwóch filozofii przetrwania na morzu. Da Gama uosabiał brutalną siłę, pragmatyzm i niezłomną determinację, gotów siłą wydrzeć oceanowi jego sekrety, podczas gdy Ibn Majid reprezentował głęboką wiedzę, naukowe podejście i harmonijne współistnienie z żywiołem, który darzył nabożnym szacunkiem. Ich pierwsze spojrzenie było niczym krzyżujące się ostrza w ciemności. Portugalczyk patrzył z inherentną kulturową podejrzliwością na muzułmańskiego uczonego, obawiając się podstępu, zaś Arab lustrował zbrojnego intruza z rezerwą i niesmakiem, widząc w nim kolejnego barbarzyńskiego najeźdźca zachodu, który z naiwną arogancją rzuca wyzwanie potędze morza. Rozmowa rozpoczęła się powoli, prowadzona przez pocącego się obficie tłumacza, który z trudem znajdował słowa, by połączyć twardy wojskowy żargon Da Gamy z poetycką, a jednocześnie ścisłą terminologią Ibn Majida. Dowódca San Gabriel żądał konkretów, odległości, kierunków, czasu żeglugi i gwarancji bezpiecznego dotarcia do Calicatu, traktując podróż jako problem taktyczny do rozwiązania. Nawigator odpowiadał spokojnie, używając metafor o oddechu Ziemi, cyklach Ziemica i układach gwiazd, co początkowo doprowadzało Portugalczyka do białej gorączki, gdyż uważał to za zwodnicze uniki i orientalne sztuczki. W półmroku komnaty, oświetlonej teraz jedynie pojedynczą jaskrawą laternią, napięcie osiągnęło zenit, a różnice religijne i kulturowe pośrodku połączył wspólny szacunek dla morza, które im przyszło stwarzać i pokonywać.
Chapter 12. Crossing the Abyss. To był 24 dzień kwietnia roku pańskiego 1498, kiedy potężne, zakute w żelazo kotwice okrętów Vasco da Gamy zostały z ogromnym wysiłkiem wyrwane z piaszczystego dna portu Malindi, oznaczając początek ostatecznego, najbardziej tajemniczego etapu ich monumentalnej epopei. Podnoszeniu kotwic towarzyszył rytmiczny, gardłowy śpiew wyczerpanych, lecz pełnych nowej nadziei marynarzy, których dłonie, zgrubiałe od soli i pokryte krwawiącymi odciskami, z morderczą determinacją pchały ciężkie dębowe ramiona kabestanu, podczas gdy grube, nasycone dziegciem liny napinały się z przeraźliwym trzaskiem, przypominającym łamane kości giganta. Gdy tylko czarne od błota i wodorostów żelazo wynurzyło się z krystalicznie czystych wód afrykańskiego wybrzeża, na masztach flagowego okrętu São Gabriel oraz towarzyszących mu jednostkach z ogłuszającym hukiem, niczym uderzenie burzowego pioruna, rozwinęły się potężne lniane żagle, na których dumnie i złowieszczo pyszniły się krwisto-czerwone krzyże zakonu Chrystusa. Światło poranka, ostre i bezlitosne, uderzało w te geometryczne symbole dawnych krucjat, nadając im niemal fizycznej, pulsującej życiem intensywności, która ostro kontrastowała z bezkresnym, głębokim, wręcz pochłaniającym granatem Oceanu Indyjskiego, rozciągającym się aż po horyzont. Powietrze wokół statków wciąż jeszcze przesiąknięte było zapachem lundu, gęstą, egzotyczną wonią palonego drewna sandałowego, suszonych na słońcu ryb, dojrzałych cytrusów i gorącego afrykańskiego pyłu, lecz z każdą upływającą minutą, z każdą pilą morską zostawianą za rufą, ten lądowy aromat słabł, wypierany przez surową, lodowatą, naładowaną ozonem i wszechobecną solą woń otwartego, nieznanego oceanu. Marynarze, wpatrzeni w znikający w oddali biały zarys minaretów i pałaców Malindi, odczuwali w sercach mieszaninę głębokiej, paraliżującej melancholii za bezpiecznym portem oraz rosnącej, gorączkowej ekscytacji na myśl o tym, co kryje się za linią horyzontu. Byli niczym aktorzy w gigantycznym, rzeźbionym przez wiatr i wodę teatrze, gdzie scena oświetlona była dramatycznym, niemal rzeźbiarskim światłem, wydobywającym z mroku każdy sęk w drewnianym pokładzie i każdą zmarszczkę na ich smaganych wiatrem wyczerpanych twarzach. Zaledwie kilka godzin po opuszczeniu bezpiecznej zatoki armada została pochwycona przez potężne, niewidzialne ramiona południowo-zachodniego monsunu, meteorologicznego zjawiska o tak niewyobrażalnej, tytanicznej sile, że wydawało się ono marynarzom niemal boską interwencją, potężnym tchnieniem samego Stwórcy, popychającym ich ku przeznaczeniu. Uderzenie wiatru było fizycznie namacalne. Statki, te potężne, pływające fortece z drewna i żelaza, zadrżały w posadach i jęknęły tysiącem głosów tartego dębu i napiętych lin, a następnie przechyliły się ostro, tnąc powierzchnię oceanu niczym gigantyczne, opancerzone ostrza. Prędkość, jaką rozwinęły karawele i nao, była dla Portugalczyków zjawiskiem dotąd niespotykanym, absolutnie oszałamiającym doświadczeniem, które wywoływało zawroty głowy. Woda wokół dziobów statków gotowała się i pieniła, tworząc wysokie, śnieżno-białe fale dziobowe, które z nieustannym, wściekłym sykiem rozbijały się o drewniane poszycie, wyrzucając w górę fontanny solnych kropel, błyszczących w słońcu jak deszcz diamentów. Kontrast pomiędzy tą niesamowitą, porywającą żeglugą, a sennym, morderczym spokojem, jakiego doświadczyli w strefie równikowej na Oceanie Atlantyckim, gdzie przez długie, torturujące tygodnie tkwili uwięzieni w martwej ciszy bezwietrznych dni pod palącym, bezlitosnym słońcem, był tak drastyczny, że wydawał się on niemal realny. Tutaj, na Oceanie Indyjskim, nie było miejsca na stagnację. Wiatr doł bezustannie z przeraźliwą mechaniczną regularnością, napinając liny do granicy wytrzymałości i zmieniając żagle w twarde, napompowane powietrzem sklepienia, pod którymi uwijała się załoga. Cały okręt wibrował, rezonował od tej nieprzerwanej, potężnej siły natury.
Chapter 13. Landfall. The Shores of Calicut. Dzień 20 maja 1498 roku wyłonił się z mroków historii nie jako zwykły wschód słońca, lecz jako brutalne, oślepiające objawienie, które miało na zawsze zmienić ośrodek ciężkości całego znanego świata. Po 10,5 miesiącach koszmarnej żeglugi, po przetrwaniu gniewu przylądka burz, po buncie, głodzie i szkorbucie, który zamieniał dziąsła żeglarzy w czarną, gnijącą masę, armada Vasco da Gamy wreszcie rzuciła kotwicę. Światło poranka przebijało się przez gęste, burzowe chmury, niczym na płótnach mistrzów światłocienia, rzucając dramatyczne, głębokie cienie na wzburzone fale Oceanu Indyjskiego, by ostatecznie spocząć na lądzie, który do tej pory istniał dla Europejczyków jedynie w sferze mitów, legend i pożółkłych od starości map. Wybrzeże Malabaru, spowite w gęstej, niemal namacalnej porannej mgle, powoli odsłaniało swoje sekrety, a zapach, który dotarł do pokładów portugalskich karawel, był czymś, czego żaden z tych zmęczonych morzem ludzi nigdy wcześniej nie doświadczył. Nie był to zapach jałowej pustyni ani dzikiej, nieujarzmionej dżungli, lecz intensywna, odurzająca mieszanka palonego drewna sandałowego, wilgotnej, żyznej ziemi, suszącego się na słońcu kardamonu i ostrego, czarnego pieprzu, który mieszał się z solą oceaniczną. Ten zapach uderzył w zmysły żeglarzy niczym fizyczny cios, uświadamiając im z przerażającą ostrością, że główny cel ich niemożliwej ekspedycji został właśnie osiągnięty. Indie, kraina przypraw i niewyobrażalnego bogactwa, przestały być fantazją, a stały się brutalnie realną, namacalną rzeczywistością, która majaczyła zaledwie kilka mil morskich od ich zniszczonych dziobów. Kiedy mgła ostatecznie opadła, rozwiana przez ciepły wiatr monsunowy, to, co ukazało się oczom Portugalczyków, całkowicie zrujnowało ich dotychczasowe, aroganckie wyobrażenia o prymitywnych ludach wschodu. Calicut nie było wioską skleconą z palmowych liści i błota, jak cicho zakładali niektórzy oficerowie na pokładzie, lecz gigantyczną, rozrastającą się we wszystkich kierunkach metropolią, tętniącą życiem i niewyobrażalnym bogactwem. Z perspektywy opartego o nadgryziony zębem czasu reling statku São Gabriel, miasto jawiło się jako nieskończony labirynt misternie rzeźbionych kamiennych świątyń, ogromnych magazynów o spadzistych dachach chroniących przed deszczami oraz rozległych pałaców, których wieżyczki i kopuły łapały pierwsze promienie słońca, błyszcząc odcieniami ochry i złota. Skala tej cywilizacji była przytłaczająca, a jej złożoność sprawiała, że Lizbona, z której wyruszyli, wydawała się w tym momencie zaledwie skromnym, prowincjonalnym miasteczkiem na skraju świata. Żeglarze, odziani w szorstkie, połatane lniane koszule, przesięknięci zapachem potu, ryb i dziegciu, wpatrywali się w ten widok w absolutnym milczeniu, a w ich oczach mieszał się triumfalny zachwyt z narastającym lodowatym lękiem przed potęgą, z którą właśnie przyszło im się zmierzyć. Zrozumieli, że nie są odkrywcami wkraczającymi na pustą kartę historii, lecz intruzami, którzy brutalnie wyważyli drzwi do starożytnego, doskonale funkcjonującego i niezwykle bogatego świata, który wcale nie potrzebował ich obecności, by prosperować. Port w Calicut stanowił serce tej oszałamiającej cywilizacji, a jego widok wprawił portugalskich nawigatorów w stan głębokiego osłupienia, gdyż zatoka przypominała gigantyczny, gęsty las drewnianych masztów kołysających się w rytm oceanicznej fali. Wody portu przecinały statki z całego świata, choć tak obcego dla Europejczyków. Były tam szmukłe arabskie dao z charakterystycznymi trójkątnymi żaglami lacińskimi, których kadłuby lśniły w słońcu dzięki grubej warstwie oleju rybiego. Były masywne, wielopokładowe czyńskie dżonki, przypominające pływające fortece, zdolne przetrwać najgorsze tajfuny, a także setki mniejszych, przybrzeżnych łodzi, zręcznie manewrujących w tym niewyobrażalnym ścisku. Kolorystyka tego widowiska była oszałamiająca. Głęboki, chłodny błękit.
Chapter 14. The Court of the Zamorin.
Duszne, przesycone gryzącym zapachem smoły, pęczniejącego od wilgoci drewna, skwaśniałego wina i zaschniętego potu powietrze w ciasnej kajucie flagowego okrętu São Gabriel zdawało się gęstnieć z każdą upływającą minutą, gdy Vasco da Gama, kapitan generalny portugalskiej armady, przygotowywał się do najważniejszej i najbardziej ryzykownej próby swojego życia. Pojedynczy strumień ostrego popołudniowego światła, wpadający przez wąski, porysowany solą iluminator, cięło dławiący mrok niczym bezlitosne ostrze, wydobywając z głębokich, przypominających najbardziej mroczne płótna Rembrandta cieni, chłodny blisk polerowanej, choć naznaczonej już rdzą stali oraz głęboką, nasyconą czerwień ciężkiego, aksamitowego kaftana, który Portugalczyk z trudem na siebie wciągał.
Każdy najdrobniejszy ruch w tym grubym, całkowicie nieprzystosowanym do okrutnego, tropikalnego klimatu Malabaru stroju wymagał ogromnego wysiłku, a szorstkie, grube płótno lnianej koszuli bezlitośnie drapało spieczoną, pokrytą morskimi wrzodami skórę, jednak da Gama z zaciętą twarzą ignorował ten fizyczny dyskomfort, napadzany czystą arogancją, niezachwianą wiarą we własną misję oraz poczuciem absolutnej wyższości. W swoim własnym, zamkniętym na niuanse umyśle nie był jedynie utrudzonym żeglarzem, cudem ocalałym po przekroczeniu burzliwego przylądka dobrej nadziei, lecz dumnym wysłannikiem najpotężniejszego monarchy całego chrześcijańskiego świata, króla Manuela I. A ten duszący aksamit, ta ciężka stal i ten zdobiony, wytarty, skórzany pas miały stanowić jego niezłomną zbroję w nadchodzącym historycznym starciu dyplomatycznym. Wokół niego, w klaustrofobicznym półmroku kajuty, tłoczyli się jego najwyżsi oficerowie, równie spoceni, równie nerwowi, z determinacją wbijający się w swoje najlepsze niedzielne szaty, które po ponad 10 miesiącach spędzonych w wilgotnych, gnijących ładowniach okrętu straciły swój pierwotny europejski blask, pachnąc teraz znak bardziej rynsztokiem, pleśnią i stęchlizną niż jakimkolwiek cywilizowanym dworem. Mimo tego ewidentnego rozkładu w ich zaczerwienionych od wiatru oczach płonęła ta sama ślepa determinacja, ten sam drapieżny głód chwały, zaszczytów i niewyobrażalnego bogactwa, który kazał im święcie wierzyć, że sama ich fizyczna obecność, sam niesamowity fakt, że zdolili pokonać nieznane, przerażające oceany, rzuci na kolana każdego, nawet najpotężniejszego wschodniego władcę. Da Gama, brutalnym ruchem poprawiając ciężki miecz u boku, którego rękojeść była gładka i lśniąca od ciągłego, nerwowego dotyku, spojrzał w małe, pęknięte mosiężne lusterko, widząc w nim twarz twardą, pooraną głębokimi zmarszczkami, z brodą lśniącą od kropel potu. Twarz człowieka, który nie zamierzał prosić o jakikolwiek układ handlowy, lecz zamierzał go bezwzględnie podyktować z pozycji siły, całkowicie, wręcz tragicznie nieświadomy faktu, jak bardzo jego naiwne europejskie wyobrażenia o potędze i bogactwie miną się z przytłaczającą rzeczywistością, która już za moment czekała na niego na rozgrzanym piastku kalikackiego brzegu. Kiedy drewniane, ociężałe łodzie wiosłowe z głośnym zgrzytem i chrzęstem drewna uderzyły o piaszczysty brzeg, a portugalscy żeglarze wyskoczyli w przytłą, ciepłą wodę, uderzyło w nich oślepiające, bezlitosne słońce Indii, stanowiące brutalny, wręcz bolesny kontrast dla dusznego, piwniczego mroku wnętrza ich statków, zmuszając ich do mrużenia oczu i zasłaniania twarzy dłońmi. Da Gama, pragnąc od pierwszej sekundy narzucić tubylcom wizję swojej militarnej potęgi, natychmiast wydał rozkaz sformowania szyku, a w gorące, nieruchome powietrze wzbił się ogłuszający, chrapliwy ryk mosiężnych trąb, brutalnie przerywany głuchymi, wibrującymi w klatce piersiowej wystrzałami z ciężkich okrętowych bombard. Gęsty, siary dym z prochu strzelniczego zawisł nad plażą niczym brudny, złowieszny całun, mieszając się z parującą z ziemi wilgocią i tworząc surrealistyczną, duszącą mgłę, przez które przebijały się jaskrawe, karmazynowe barwy rozwinięty.
Chapter 15. Wojna kupców.
Gęsty, duszny mrok opadł na Calicut, spowijając gwarne za dnia ulice w lepkiej, monsunowej wilgoci, która zdawała się przenikać przez każdą warstwę odzienia i osiadać ciężko na płucach, dławiąc każdy najmniejszy oddech. W jednej z ukrytych, bogato zdobionych komnat, zlokalizowanej głęboko w labiryncie wąskich uliczek z dala od ciekawskich spojrzeń portowych strażników i wścibskich uszu szpiegów potężnego Zamorina, zebrała się elita arabskich kupców, prawdziwych, choć niekolonowanych władców tego ogromnego wybrzeża. Scena ta w każdym najdrobniejszym calu przypominała najmroczniejsze i najbardziej dramatyczne płótna wielkich mistrzów pędzla, takich jak Caravaggio czy Rembrandt, gdzie jedynym samotnym źródłem światła w rozległym, pełnym przepychu pomieszczeniu była masywna, mosiężna i misternie rzeźbiona lampa olejna zawieszona nisko nad potężnym hebanowym stołem. Jej ciepły, drżący, bursztynowy blask z ogromnym trudem przebijał się przez gęste powietrze, wydobywając z mroku ostre, drapieżne rysy twarzy zgromadzonych mężczyzn, bezlitośnie podkreślając głębokie zmarszczki wyrzeźbione przez długie lata bezlitosnych negocjacji, nienasyconej chciwości i słonych, morskich wiatrów, podczas gdy reszta komnaty tonęła w nieprzeniknionych, atramantowych cieniach, doskonale ukrywając prawdziwe intencje zgromadzonych.
Powietrze w komnacie było nieznośnie ciężkie od duszącego dymu drogocennego kadzidła, bezceremonialnie zmieszanego z ostrym, wszechobecnym, świdrującym zmysły zapachem kardamonu, cynamonu, goździków i czarnego pieprzu, czyli tych samych egzotycznych przypraw, które stanowiły absolutny fundament ich niewyobrażalnej potęgi i bezkresnego bogactwa. Zgromadzeni kupcy odziani w najdelikatniejsze jedwabne szaty o nasyconych, choć celowo przygaszonych w półmroku barwach głębokiego karmazynu, tajemniczego indygo i ciemnego matowego złota, siedzieli w nienaturalnym, niemal bolesnym napięciu, które można było kroić nożem. Ich dłonie, których palce były gęsto ozdobione ciężkimi, szczero-złotymi sygnetami z osadzonymi w nich krwawymi rubinami i chłodnymi szmaragdami, nerwowo bębniły o twardy blat stołu, wydając głuchy, rytmiczny dźwięk, który w absolutnej ciszy przypominał tykanie nieubłaganego zegara odliczającego czas do nieuniknionej gospodarczej katastrofy. Byli to bezwzględni i niezwykle wyrachowani ludzie, którzy od wielu długich stuleci nieprzerwanie kontrolowali każdy pojedynczy ładunek, każdy przepływający statek i każdą uncję złota przepływającą przez ten najważniejszy węzeł handlowy ówczesnego świata, bezwzględnie dyktując ceny i zmuszając do uległości nawet najpotężniejszych monarchów. Teraz jednak w obliczu niespodziewanego przybycia nędznej, zrujnowanej, ale śmiertelnie niebezpiecznej floty pod dowództwem Vasco da Gamy, po raz pierwszy od pokoleń poczuli lodowaty dreszcz strachu i prawdziwe, namacalne zagrożenie dla swojego starożytnego, nienaruszalnego monopolu. Ich szepty, początkowo ostrożne i ciche niczym syk jadowitego węża, z każdą mijającą minutą zaczęły przybierać na sile i gwałtowności, nieuchronnie zwiastując początek nowej, bezlitosnej i mrocznej wojny cieni, w której stawką było nie tylko przetrwanie, ale absolutna dominacja nad całym globalnym rynkiem, o którą zamierzali walczyć za wszelką cenę, nie cofając się przed najgorszym, najniższym podstępem. Said, charyzmatyczny i niekwestionowany przywódca tej potężnej kupieckiej kabały, człowiek o przenikliwym czarnym spojrzeniu i umyśle ostrym jak damaszceńską stal, pochylił się nad stołem, a światło lampy wyostrzyło jego surowe rysy, nadając mu wygląd drapieżnego ptaka gotowego do ataku. Jego głos, choć cichy i opanowany, niósł w sobie ogromny ciężar autorytetu i nieznoszącej sprzeciwu determinacji, gdy z brutalną szczerością analizował naturę portugalskiego zagrożenia, oddzierając je z jakichkolwiek złudzeń. Z pogardą opisywał nędzny stan floty da Gamy, wyśmiewając ich połatane żagle, gnijące kadłuby statków zniszczonych przez niekończące się sztormy.
Chapter 16. Hostages and Gunpowder Diplomacy.
Zastój w porcie Calicut, trwający od 3 niekończących się miesięcy, przerodził się w gęstą, duszną atmosferę przypominającą powietrze tuż przed uderzeniem cyklonu, gdzie każdy oddech zdawał się palić płuca, a najmniejszy gest na brzegu był analizowany przez znużone, ale czujne oczy portugalskich żeglarzy. Dni zlewały się w jednostajny koszmar parnego upału, zapachu gnijących wodorostów, egzotycznych przypraw i narastającej paranoi, która powoli toczyła umysły załogi niczym niewidzialna choroba. Zamorin, potężny władca tego tętniącego życiem handlowego imperium, początkowo zaintrygowany dziwnymi przybyszami zza zachodniego oceanu, poddał się ostatecznie nieustającej, jadowitej presji arabskich kupców, którzy szeptali w mroku pałacowych korytarzy, widząc w Portugalczykach śmiertelne zagrożenie dla swojego wielowiekowego monopolu. Zmiana taktyki władcy była nagła, brutalna i pozbawiona jakichkolwiek dyplomatycznych subtelności. Z jego rozkazu, przekazanego przez uzbrojonych po zęby strażników w lśniących pancerzach, nałożono na portugalskie statki absolutne embargo, zabraniając im opuszczania wód portowych pod groźbą zatopienia, chyba że uiszczą gigantyczną opłatę celną w szczerym złocie, co w praktyce równało się konfiskaci ich poubijanej przez oceany floty. Co gorsza i co miało stać się iskrą rzuconą na beczkę prochu, Zamorin nakazał uwięzić kilku ludzi da Gamy, w tym zaufanych oficerów i pisarzy, którzy przybywali na lądzie, próbując rozpaczliwie negocjować ceny goździków i cynamonu w zatłoczonych, krętych uliczkach faktorii. Byli teraz zakładnikami, trzymanymi w ciemnych, wilgotnych lochach pałacu,
Ich los był całkowicie niepewny, a ich wolność stała się kartą przetargową w okrutnej grze, w której stawką była dominacja nad najbogatszymi szlakami handlowymi świata. Ta zdrada, ten cyniczny akt wrogości uderzył w statki z siłą fizycznego ciosu, wprowadzając załogę w stan najwyższego wrzenia, w którym strach mieszał się z żądzą natychmiastowej, krwawej zemsty, a oczy wszystkich zwróciły się ku kapitanowi, oczekując rozkazu, który miał zmienić bieg historii. Zamorin, podejmując tę brzemienną w skutki decyzję, popełnił jednak fundamentalny, katastrofalny w swoich następstwach błąd w ocenie przeciwnika, traktując Portugalczyków jak kolejną grupę uległych kupców, z którymi można pogrywać za pomocą lokalnej polityki i zastraszenia. Nie zdawał sobie sprawy, że Vasco da Gama nie był jedynie nawigatorem czy handlarzem, lecz dumnym, nieustępliwym i niebezpiecznie bezwzględnym wysłannikiem korony. Człowiekiem o żelaznej woli, który przetrwał sztormy przylądka dobrej nadziei, szkorbut dziesiątkujący jego ludzi i bunty własnej załogi, a którego umysł operował w kategoriach bezwzględnej siły i honoru równie twardego jak stal jego miecza. Gdy wieści o uwięzieniu towarzyszy dotarły do dusznej, oświetlonej jedynie żemplącym płomieniem świecy kajuty na statku São Gabriel, twarz da Gamy nie wyraziła strachu ani wahania, lecz stężała w maskę chłodnej, wyrachowanej furii, a jego oczy pociemniały, przypominając wzburzony ocean tuż przed uderzeniem burzy. W półmroku przypominającym płótna Caravaggia, gdzie ostre sienie kładły się na starych mapach i porysowanym drewnie biurka, kapitan podjął decyzję o odrzuceniu wszelkich pozorów dyplomacji, uznając, że w świecie, który nie rozumie języka traktatów, jedynym słyszalnym argumentem będzie brutalny ryk armat i bezwzględna przemoc, która zaszokuje wroga i rzuci go na kolana. Nie zamierzał czekać, nie zamierzał pisać kolejnych bezcelowych petycji do władcy, który splamił swój honor zdradą, zatem co z zimną krwią zaplanował kontruderzenie, które miało odwrócić rolę w tej niebezpiecznej grze i pokazać mieszkańcom Malabaru, że chrześcijańscy żeglarze potrafią być demonami zniszczenia, jeśli zostaną sprowokowani. Okazja do wdrożenia tego bezlitosnego planu nadarzyła się niemal od razu, gdy następnego ranka, nieświadomi radykalnego nastroju zmiany na portugalskich okrętach, grupa wysoko...
Chapter 17. The Long, Deadly Voyage Home.
The departure from the vibrant, spice-scented shores of India in the sweltering month of August was a decision born of profound arrogance and a catastrophic ignorance of the natural rhythms that govern the Arabian Sea. Vasco da Gama, flush with the unprecedented triumph of reaching Calicut, felt an urgent, almost feverish need to return to Lisbon to lay the wealth of the East at the feet of King Manuel. Below the decks of the São Gabriel, the São Rafael and the Berrio, the holds were heavy with the exotic spoils of their historic endeavor. Sacks of pungent black pepper, bundles of fragrant cinnamon, fragile porcelains and shimmering silks that seemed to hold the light of a foreign sun. Yet this treasure was a deceptive ballast, anchoring the fleet to a false sense of invincibility. As the coastline of the subcontinent receded into a hazy, shimmering mirage, swallowed by the oppressive humidity of the tropical horizon, the reality of their situation remained terrifyingly obscured from the commander. Da Gama did not know that the monsoon winds, the great cyclical breath of the Indian Ocean, were currently blowing with relentless, untamable fury from the southwest, directly against their intended course back to the African coast. The Portuguese, masters of the Atlantic, were entirely blind to the meteorological trap they had just sailed into. The vibrant colors of India faded into a muted, brooding palette of storm cloud grays and churning dark ocean blues, signaling the beginning of a voyage that would dwarf the horrors of their outbound journey. The triumph of discovery was almost immediately eclipsed by a creeping atmospheric dread as the ships began to pitch and roll violently against an invisible, omnipresent wall of wind.
Almost immediately upon reaching the open ocean, the brutal reality of the opposing monsoon winds asserted itself with a terrifying physical violence that threatened to tear the small fleet apart. The winds did not merely blow, they battered the wooden hulls with the force of siege engines, screaming through the intricate web of rigging with a high-pitched, demonic wail that drowned out the frantic shouts of the sailors. The journey across the Arabian Sea, which with favorable winds should have taken a brisk and manageable 3 weeks, morphed into an agonizing, seemingly endless 3-month ordeal of unimaginable suffering. Progress was not measured in leagues, but in mere yards gained through the back-breaking, blood-letting labor of men hauling on wet, coarse ropes until their hands were rubbed raw and bleeding. The ships, heavily laden with their precious cargo, groaned and shrieked under the immense atmospheric pressure, their rough-hewn timbers constantly flexing and weeping salt water. The visual reality of their existence became a Caravaggio painting in motion, desperate, exhausted faces illuminated by the fleeting pale light of storm-filtered sun or the violent, chaotic flashes of lightning, surrounded by an encroaching, suffocating darkness. The ocean, rather than a highway to glory, transformed into an actively hostile entity, sending towering, black-faced waves to crash over the decks, sweeping away unsecured barrels and threatening to drag men into the cold, churning abyss. Every inch of westward movement was a physical battle against the very breath of nature, a war of attrition that the already weary Portuguese crew was ill-equipped to fight, turning the fleet into a collection of besieged fortresses floating upon an endlessly raging battlefield. When the monsoon winds momentarily exhausted their fury, they did not leave peace in their wake, but rather a suffocating, maddening stillness that was in many ways worse than the violent storms. The fleet would find itself becalmed for long, agonizing stretches, trapped in the doldrums beneath a brutal, unforgiving equatorial sun that beat down upon the decks like a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil. The ocean, rather than a highway to glory, transformed into an actively hostile entity, sending towering, black-faced waves to crash over the decks, sweeping away unsecured barrels and threatening to drag men into the cold, churning abyss. Every inch of westward movement was a physical battle against the very breath of nature, a war of attrition that the already weary Portuguese crew was ill-equipped to fight, turning the fleet into a collection of besieged fortresses floating upon an endlessly raging battlefield.
Chapter 18. Zmieniony człowiek, zmieniony świat.
Ocean Atlantyczny, zazwyczaj łaskawy i przewidywalny w tych umiarkowanych szerokościach geograficznych, teraz w okolicach archipelagu Azorów stał się aremą apokaliptycznego gniewu żywiołów, jakby same niebiosa chciały ukarać śmiałków za przekroczenie granic nieznanego świata. 2 ocalałe statki ekspedycji, Berrio oraz flagowy São Gabriel, niczym kruche, bezradne łupiny orzecha rzucone na powierzchnię gotującej się czarnej smoły, desperacko walczyły o przetrwanie w lodowatych objęciach morderczego sztormu. Niebo nad nimi przybrało barwę głębokiego, ołowianego szarego, przeplatanego gniewnymi, pulsującymi błyskami fioletu i absolutnej czerni, przypominając te najbardziej dramatyczne płótna, które wieki później miał z taką pasją malować Rembrandt. Wiatr wył z ogłuszającą mocą, przypominając upiorny chór potępionych dusz, drąc na strzęby resztki płóciennych żagli i łamiąc grube dębowe maszty z przerażającym suchym trzaskiem, który echem odbijał się w trzewiach przerażonych żeglarzy. Woda, ciemna, gęsta i nieprzenikniona jak atrament, przelewała się przez pokłady w postaci pionowych ścian, zmywając bezlitośnie wszystko, co nie było solidnie przykute żelaznymi łańcuchami do burt. W tym niewyobrażalnym chaosie, pośród ryczących fal i oślepiających strug deszczu, wizualna więź między okrętami została brutalnie i ostatecznie przerwana.
Słabe światło latarni sztormowej zawieszonej na rufie São Gabriel, będące przez długie miesiące jedynym punktem orientacyjnym i symbolem nadziei dla zdesperowanej załogi Berrio, zniknęło nagle w gęstym mroku, pochłonięte przez ryczącą wodną otchłań. Nicolau Coelho, kapitan Berrio, z twarzą głęboko zoraną przez kryształki soli, lodowaty wiatr i skrajne, wielomiesięczne wyczerpanie, musiał w ułamku sekundy podjąć najtrudniejszą decyzję w swoim życiu. W ostrym, rzucającym głębokie cienie świetle pojedynczej latarni, jego oblicze wyglądało niczym wyjęte z obrazów Caravaggia, pełne ostrych kontrastów, napiętych mięśni i wszechogarniającego dramatu. Zrozumiał z ciężkim, niemal pękającym sercem, że jakakolwiek próba szukania okrętu flagowego i swojego dowódcy w tym rozpętanym piekle oznaczała pewną śmierć dla jego własnych ludzi. Trzymając się kurczowo oblodzonej, szorstkiej barierki, z dłońmi zdartymi do krwi od ciągnięcia mokrych, sztywnych lin, wydał chropowatym głosem rozkaz utrzymania kursu na wschód, prosto ku zbawczym brzegom Portugalii. Rozdzielenie floty stało się tragicznym faktem. Bezlitosny ocean ostatecznie rozerwał ich małą, wycieńczoną flotylnę, pozostawiając każdego z kapitanów samemu sobie na bezkresnym, ciemnym pustkowiu, gdzie jedynym towarzyszem każdego z marynarzy był paraliżujący strach i dręcząca niepewność co do ostatecznego losu ich towarzyszy broni. 10 lipca 1499 roku zwiastował świt ociężały od gęstej mlecznej mgły, która spowijała szerokie ujście rzeki tak, niby wilgotny, chłodny całun. Właśnie z tej nieprzeniknionej bieli, niczym milcząca zjawa z zaświatów, wyłonił się Berrio. Nie był to już ten sam dumny, lśniący świeżą smołą i jasnym, zdrowym drewnem statek, który ponad 2 lata wcześniej odpuszczał port w Lizbonie przy dźwiękach fanfar i modlitw tłumów. Teraz przypominał dryfujący wrak, upiorny okręt widmu z poszarpanymi żaglami, na których ledwie można było dostrzec wyblakłego, spłowianego od słońca i soli karmazynowy krzyż zakonu Chrystusa. Kadłub karaweli był grubo obrośnięty twardą skorupą pąkli, ostrymi jak brzytwa muszlami i spłątanymi wodorastami, a samo drewno zszarzało i popękało od palącego słońca równika i żorącej, słonej wody bezlitosnego Oceanu Indyjskiego. Kiedy powoli, napędzana resztkami sił wiatru, karawela mijała potężną kamienną wieżę w Belem, miejscowi rybacy na swoich małych drewnionych łodziach zamarli w absolutnym bezruchu, nie wierząc własnym oczom. Cisza, która zapanowała w tym momencie nad rzeką, była niemal namacalna, gęsta i ciężka, przerywana jedynie cichym, rytmicznym skrzypknięć